Call this City Council successor agency to the Redevelopment Agency Housing Authority regular meeting to order. If you'd all please join me by rising for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I apologize for, I forgot to wrap the gavel to say we were open. I apologize for the meeting starting late, but we were in closed session and the vice mayor just kept going on and on and on and on. I couldn't get him to stop. So I'll blame somebody else next time. No, seriously, it was a good discussion. And in fact, well, that's coming up at this. First, do we have any changes to the order of the agenda from either staff or my colleagues?
Nothing from staff this evening, Mr. Chair.
Nothing from the dais, then we'll proceed with the agenda as posted. The next item is report from that closed session. Greg, do you have a report from the closed session?
Yes, the City Council conducted a closed session in conformance with the government code. No action was taken and no direction was given.
Thank you, Greg. Next item on the agenda is item 5A, receive a presentation from Silicon Valley Clean Water on the work and services actually it says provided, but I think you're still providing to the city of San Carlos and doing a great job at it too. We have here with us tonight, starting us off, Steve Makita. Good evening, Steve.
Good evening, Mr. Chair and City Council members. Stephen Machida, Public Works Director. So actually, I have the pleasure of actually introducing the manager and the Chief Financial Officer to the Silicon Valley Clean Water. The manager is Teresa Herrera, and the CFO is Matt Anderson. So they are actually here tonight to actually do a presentation to you to kind of give you an overview of all the services that they provide to the city of San Carlos and our tributary agencies. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Teresa.
Thank you, Steve. Welcome, Teresa. Welcome, Matt. Good to see you both again. I say that because I serve as our representative on your board. And, you know, Teresa, I realized after we met for the first time the other week that you have an even worse job than Steve does, because nobody even ever thinks about what Steve's people do, and you're even further down the system than he is. But thank you for the good work your organization does for us.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair and council members. Appreciate you inviting us over here. I always like to I won't say brag, but talk about how SVCW operates and the work we do. So with that, we'll get started. This is just an outline of what we'll talk about today. And of course, just interrupt if there's any questions as I go along. I want to introduce the primary setup of SVCW. We have a commission of 4 members, one from each of our member agencies, San Carlos being one of them. And the commission members are appointed by the councils and board. We have working directly for the commission our legal counsel, our controller, who's the CFO at City, Redwood City, and then myself as manager. And the senior management staff is myself, Matt Anderson, Kim Hackett, who's our authority engineer, and Moni Hamamoto, who is our chief operating officer. So we were founded as South Bayside System Authority, SBSA, in the late 60s. As I said, we're governed by a commission of 4 appointed from our member agencies. And the voting is conducted by the allocation of ownership, and that's outlined in our JPA according to the table at the bottom of the slide. And I'm also listing the appointed commissioners on our commission from each of the member agencies, Mark Olbert being the City of San Carlos representative. Generally, we require a 75% vote for anything to be passed that relates to rules, bylaws, JPA changes, capital expenses and operating expenses. And also, if we make any JPA amendments, that requires it come back to the member agency councils for approval by 4/5 vote. And I point that out because we are undergoing some changes to the JPA since it's so old, and a lot of it's not pertinent anymore. So at some point within the next year, hopefully we'll be bringing the JPA changes to the council. So we convey wastewater from our 4 member agencies. We treat it at our wastewater treatment plant, which is at the end of Redwood Shores Parkway. That dot is a little bit off, but pretty close. We're actually right on the bay. And then we dispose of the water either by discharging to the bay. Our outfall is just south of the San Mateo Bridge, about 1.5 miles off the shoreline. And we recycle part of our water for the city of Redwood City, about 1 to 2 million gallons a day, depending on demand. We have 9 miles of pipeline conveying the sewers from each of the member agencies' collection systems, 4 pump stations, 1 booster station, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And our treatment capacity is permitted for 29 MGD, million gallons per day. And currently with combination of the drought as well as people, saving water, being more conscious of water use, we're treating 13 million gallons a day. Our allocations for member agencies for capital and O&M costs are a little complex. Capital costs are defined in the JPA, and that doesn't change. And you can see the numbers in the table below, including San Carlos's. Our operating costs are based on a 3-year running average, and that's a combination of flow that you send to us, the BOD, which is biochemical oxygen demand, and that's a measure of the strength of the wastewater, and suspended solids, which is the SS. And you can see there's a different percentage for each of those constituents, flow, BOD, and suspended solids. And so that number does change year to year, and the numbers shown in the table are from 2018. I was asked to talk a little bit about our capital improvements, and our original facilities were built they put online in 1980 at a cost of $65 million, 92% of which was grant funded. And that was in the era of the Clean Water Act, and where plants had to go to secondary treatment, so the federal and state government put a lot of money towards that effort. We estimate the current value, if we need to replace all the facilities, at $2 billion, probably higher than that at this point. We began our capital improvement program in 2008, and thus far we spent $290 million, and you can see what's remaining. The majority of what's remaining is to our conveyance projects, which we call Rescue. We update the CIP every year to 2 years, just to keep up with what's going on with our projects. So the Rescue program is our regional environmental sewer conveyance upgrade, and it's a combination of 3 major projects: our gravity pipe, our front of plant projects, and our pump station improvements. And here's just a slide that shows the different aspects of the program. Our pump stations are the little blue dots. We have a pump station at Menlo Park, Redwood City, Belmont. Currently, San Carlos does have a a pump station, but it's going to be decommissioned because we're converting our force main, our pressure pipe that conveys wastewater, to a gravity pipe. That means we don't have to pump from San Carlos, which is really great news because it'll save a lot of both capital and operating costs. And then our front-of-plant projects are occurring, which includes pretreatment. It's to lift the water from the gravity pipe, which is coming in about 70 feet below ground, and then it pumps it up to the surface and sends it through our screens and grit removal system. Briefly, we fund the program from various sources. Currently, we're using our bond proceeds from last year's issuance at $80 million. We are currently working with the state to get state revolving fund loan. That's a very low interest loan program, so really good money for us to get. We also were invited by EPA, federal EPA, to apply for a WIFIA, Water Infrastructure Financing Innovation Act. I think that's what it stands for. Wow. And the EPA has told us that we are eligible for about $230 million of that money. So you'll be seeing in the next couple months, I think April is when we're going to come to the council for with our WIFIA funding request. Just showing a couple pictures of what's happening. This is at the corner of Redwood Shores Parkway and Shoreway, so you can probably see it if you go maybe to the Nob Hill Center or across 101. What this is they're building a SOE walls, which is supportive excavation. So they'll be putting a series of probably 10 of these rebar cages down in the ground, 60 foot deep, and then they'll fill it with concrete, and that will form the wall that will support them to be able to excavate the shaft. Here's a couple other pictures of them placing the rebar cages. They anticipate they'll be done with this, I think they said maybe in a month's time or so, and then they'll start pouring concrete and then excavating the shaft. Lastly, our pump station project, that has not started yet. We're going to bring to our commission a recommendation to award the design-build contract for the pump station project at our February commission meeting, which is on the 25th. And the scope of it is we're going to replace the Redwood City pump station and rehabilitate both the Belmont and Menlo Park pump stations. And as I said, the San Carlos station will be decommissioned because we don't need it anymore. And timing-wise, this is critical because once the gravity pipe finishes, we have to have the pump stations ready to go. So those two are the endpoints of those two projects need to match. And with that, I just want to extend an offer for a tour of our treatment plant. We're really proud of what we do out there, and would love to give you a tour and explain a little bit more in detail of what we do. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Teresa. That was great. And by the way, I've only had a brief partial tour so far. I have still to get back to you on picking one, but I'm really looking forward to that because it's an integral part of life nowadays that almost nobody is familiar with, and it's important to know. One other observation I wanted to make before I open it up for questions is, by my calculations, San Carlos's share of the total cost of the project, both what's been spent and going forward, is on the order of $128 million. It's 15% of that. And I mention that just because that's paid for currently through our sanitary fees. And that is probably, and Jeff, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think that is probably the largest project certainly in recent San Carlos memory, dollar-wise.
There's no need to correct you.
I kind of figured that. With that, I see Ron. Looks like you have some questions.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Teresa. Nice presentation. Just a couple of questions. Tell me again what SOE means.
It's a support of excavation.
Support of excavation. So basically
So basically they have to create concrete walls and then they can start excavating the shaft.
You ever walked out there and seen how muddy the ground is?
No, don't really want to.
For an excavation that deep, you can't just start digging because the walls will cave in. So you have to support it with concrete.
That answers a question that people have been asking me when I go work out at the club. They say, what are they
What's
building
happening?
there? They think they're building a building. So I
gotten that a
I
lot,
didn't think
yeah.
so
No.
because of its proximity to the airport. Okay, so thank you. The other, if you could go back to that map that shows on the rescue program, that one. When you talk about the San Carlos pump station, is that the one that's just right around where it says pump stations? Is that ours? Where the dash line meets the green line?
Where it says Holly Street?
Yeah. That,
There's a little blue box behind this purple dot. That's
Okay.
where the San Carlos. It's right across the street from the museum, right there, the Hiller.
oh, from Hiller. Okay. All right. And when the treatment is done, what's the quality of the water? I don't assume it's drinking quality, but what is the quality?
Not quite. It's called tertiary treatment, and it's tertiary because we filter it. So it's disinfected and filtered, and then the chlorine, we add chlorine, and then we add bisulfite, which takes the chlorine out. So it's a tertiary treatment plant. It's suitable for landscape irrigation, but not for drinking.
Thank you.
Not many plants do tertiary treatment to dispose into the bay. The reason we do is because way back when there used to be clam beds right off the shore of the bay, and so in our permit is a requirement to filter, and they never took that out, so we filter all of our water.
Thank you.
Adam?
Thank you, and thank you, Teresa, for the presentation. Can you talk a little bit, I'm just curious more, I know you mentioned that Redwood City is getting recycled water from you, and just sort of what that process was to do that, if it's something that we want to look at some point based on sort of drought and other things.
Right, so Redwood City paid for and built a recycled water distribution center on our plant site, and which included the disinfection tank, the pumping, and the distribution pipeline going out. To expand it, we're actually working on expanding our recycled water delivery system, and have been working with your Public Works folks to expand into whatever city wants recycled water.
Just for a little bit additional clarification, so we actually are working to establish a pilot program for recycled water. We actually have purchased a water tanker truck that actually is fully outfitted for it, and so now we're just trying to establish the program such that we could actually provide some recycled water to our community, and so that program should be rolling out here fairly shortly within March, April timeframe.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions? I had one or two. So, Teresa, I'd be interested if you could talk a little bit about, I think of it as sort of our capital investment exposure for, because the requirements that we have to meet, the federal and state requirements that we have to meet, tend to evolve over time. And so the scope of the program is currently defined. There's no guarantee that that's actually the only dollars we're going to spend. So could you give us a little color on what some of the risk factors that you manage and think about as possibilities that we should be aware of?
Yes. So the regulations usually will come from the state or federal level, like you note, and typically we have at least 10 years to implement any new regulations that come along. We're currently working with the State Water Resources Control Board, the local region for the Bay Area, on what they call a nutrient reduction program, and nutrients being nitrogen and phosphorus. We're seeing the possibility that there's algae blooms happening in the bay. I don't know if you all recall what happened in Chesapeake Bay 10, 15 years ago. There was algae bloom, eutrophication, and takes away all the oxygen in the water. So we've been working with the regional board we being the 39 treatment plants around the Bay Area, to do scientific studies of the Bay to see if we can prove or not. So that's been going on for about 4 years. We see some movement from the regional board that we will probably have something in our 2019 permit to study and then maybe do what we call side stream treatment, a small portion of our treatment flow starting in 2024, and then in 2029. It's a 5-year cycle for permits. 2029, maybe having to do something more. Other than that, I don't see anything coming down the pike. You know, there will be no doubt, but usually we have a lot of time to plan and save money for it.
From a purely financial point of view, I mean, I don't think anybody wants to see the Bay suffer eutrophication, which is pretty ugly and terrible. But from a purely financial point of view, I'm gratified to hear that it looks like that'll be the end of the 2020s, if in fact it comes through, because I remember some earlier point, Bob Grassilli had told me that price tag for that might be as much just for us of like another $100 million. I don't mean just for us, San Carlos. I meant for the entire treatment facility.
The original estimate 4 years ago was $100 million. We've been scaling that back as more information comes from the scientific studies and the regional board.
Good. Last thing I just want to mention, again, for the benefit of my colleagues, something that I've often, Jeff, I think this year we have to review and modify potentially the sewer rates again, right? The sanitary sewer rates.
That's correct. Yeah, that'll be coming in short order.
One of the things that always happens with that is people who have lived in town for a long time remember when sewer rates basically didn't change for probably decades, or if not a couple of decades there. In large part, in hindsight, probably they should have been going up so we wouldn't have to spend all this money now to retrofit the plant. So that's just something to keep in mind, that politically it creates a bit of an issue, because folks are like, why are you doing this to us? Because for a long time, for most of my life, I haven't had to deal with this. But that's because we deferred stuff down the road. Thank you very much for the presentation. Thank you both for coming. Steve, thank you for arranging this.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
All right. Next on the agenda is public comment. This is time for individuals to address the council on items that are not on the agenda. I have one speaker card for an item not on the agenda. That's Ken Castle. Ken, if you'd like to come forward, you have 2 minutes. If there's anybody else who would like to address the council on an item not on the agenda, please feel free to do so. Fill out a card and give it to Crystal. And if you have something you want to talk about on an agendized item, you can hand that in to her as well, and we'll do it when we get there. Ken.
Good evening, Mayor Albert and council members. I just have a few brief comments to make in this part of the meeting. It's about public participation and city council work retreats and study sessions. As you know, it's been the custom here to have these work retreats on Fridays, where very few people attend. Traditionally, I've been going to these, I don't know, the last 10, 12 years. And I have come from places where the sessions are held on different dates, generally on a weekend. And recently I got curious to see what kind of practices are done elsewhere in the county and on the peninsula. And what I found is that the majority of the cities are doing their what they call goal-setting workshops on a Saturday. And interestingly enough, there are 4 cities that did their study session, their goal-setting session, on Saturday, February 2nd. And those cities are San Mateo, Menlo Park, Palo Alto, and Cupertino. I also found that Burlingame, where I lived for many years, always had their Saturday sessions, their goal-setting sessions. Their session was held on January 26th, also a Saturday. Pacifica has one coming up in March. What I'm seeing from all of this is that with the pace of development and all the major projects that are coming to major peninsula cities, that and some of the surveys that they have done among residents have indicated that people are not entirely comfortable with everything that happens in city government, and that the city councils and the city governments are looking to reach out by having these Saturday sessions. To quote Mayor Ray Mueller from Menlo Park, he said, well, I believe the weekend date will make it easier for the working public to attend. So I would encourage you to take a look at that and you could have it anytime before the end of the fiscal year or the beginning of the next fiscal year. But I would seriously contend that we get into best practices and start doing these kinds of sessions on Saturdays, even if you do just one a year, to let the public come and speak. Thanks.
Thank you, Ken. I have another card for an item not on the agenda from Rick Ostiller. Thank you.
Good evening, Mr. Chair and council members. Thank you for the chance to speak tonight. So my name is Rick Ostiller, and I'm a resident of 777 Walnut Street, which is the 20-unit or so condo that was opened last year. And I'm also a member of the Homeowners Association board as the treasurer. And I wanted to come today just to talk about the easement that the city maintains is on the north end of the property, which allows access from Walnut Street to the parking lot that's west of the Laurel Street. And I realize we're going to, what I'd like to, ultimately my goal is to have this as an agenda item in a later meeting, but to discuss this. But just in brief, what has happened is when the property was being marketed by the developer, we were told that those gates that allow access to the property either from Walnut Street or from the parking lot west of Laurel would be locked all the time. After many of us purchased, we found out that the city maintains there's an easement, and so the developer was asked to keep the gates open or unlocked. Since then, we've now learned in the last week that the city has asked the developer either to remove the gate, I think it's just the one by the parking lot, but maybe even both of them, or to move the one by the parking lot further west. And obviously the homeowners are not happy about these changes and what they were led to believe would be the security for the location, and therefore our request is that we have a chance to talk about this at a subsequent meeting and that the developer be allowed to keep the gates where they are until we have that discussion. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Is there anybody else who wishes to address the council on an item not on the agenda? Seeing none, we will move on to the next item on the agenda, which is the consent calendar. Consent calendar are items that are typically approved en masse, although without discussion, although any council member can ask that an item be taken off of the consent calendar and dealt with separately. Is there a motion to approve the consent calendar, or does somebody have something they want to take off?
Mr. Chair, I'll move to approve the City Council consent calendar items A through D.
Second.
There is a motion and a second, and apparently you're in good luck tonight, Ron. There is no long, lengthy thing you need to read along with that, so good. Crystal, would you please call the roll?
Councilmember Collins?
Yes.
Councilmember McDowell?
Yes.
Councilmember Palmer Lohan?
Yes.
Councilmember Rack?
Yes.
And Councilmember Olbert?
Yes. We'll move on to the next item on the agenda, item 8A, a public hearing, consideration of introducing an ordinance amending San Carlos Municipal Code Title 18, zoning, consisting of modifications to Chapter 18.24, wireless telecommunications facilities, and rescinding Chapter 12.32, wireless telecommunications facilities. Good evening, Al.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman and members of the City Council. Today, to bring the city of San Carlos into compliance with state and federal regulations for wireless telecommunications, the Planning Commission is recommending that you consider the ordinance that's before you this evening. And to walk you through the details of the ordinance and why you're being asked to consider this ordinance, we have Lisa Porras, our principal planner, and also Greg Rubens is available to answer questions. Following her presentation, Lisa's available too. Thank you.
Thank you, Al. Good evening, Lisa. Good to see you again.
Good evening, Chair Olbert and fellow council members. It's great to be here. Again, my name is Lisa Porras, and I'm the principal planner for the city's planning division, and I'll be presenting the item before you this evening. And like Al mentioned, the purpose of this ordinance update is to bring our existing wireless telecommunications ordinance into compliance with state and federal laws. Our existing ordinance was last updated in the year 2011. Another reason for the ordinance update is also to address some emerging technology that's occurring in the telecommunications industry. And by emerging technology, I will be referring to small cell wireless facilities. So the ordinance that is available in your packet that's before you this evening was prepared by Deputy City Attorney Kai Reese in consultation with the Planning Division staff. And Kai Reese has also helped other municipalities draft similar ordinances to ensure compliance with state and federal laws. And again, as Al mentioned, our City Attorney Greg Rubens is here tonight to help answer any technical or legal questions about the ordinance as it pertains to state and federal mandates. So to begin, as most of us have experienced or have seen in our environment, wireless facilities generally consist of the large antennas that are either found attached to a pole or a tower, mounted on the tops of buildings, or hidden or concealed within the architecture of existing structures. When we look around, we see these large antennas, which are also referred to macro facilities in our environment. And these wireless facilities include not only the antennas themselves, but also the associated equipment that is oftentimes placed in above ground cabinets, which are then screened from view either by strategic placement on the site or by landscaping or other site features. All of the wireless facilities that you see in our jurisdiction had to have approval by the city and receive a building permit before they can be installed. Currently in San Carlos's municipal code, there are 2 chapters governing wireless facilities. The first is Chapter 1824, which is located in the zoning ordinance itself, and it sets forth standards, requirements, and permitting procedures. The second area found in the municipal code is Chapter 12.32, which is the Streets, Sidewalks, and Public Places Ordinance, and it has regulations and requirements for wireless facilities, specifically those that are located in the right-of-way or on city property. And due to the duplicative nature of Chapter 1232, staff is recommending, and the Planning Commission is recommending, that it be removed entirely, and key components of that chapter have been integrated into the proposed Chapter 1812, so that whether facilities are on private or public property, all of the regulations are codified into one place. So now I'd just like to talk a little bit about the regulatory environment, and I think this will come into play later as you'll understand the framework for updating the ordinance. The current regulatory environment sets the framework, again, for the update, and there are laws that are passed by Congress, interpretation of those laws and orders set by the Federal Communications Commission, and then permit procedures and aesthetic controls that are set locally by the City of San Carlos. So together, those are the three areas of law that govern wireless facilities. And the foundation of the laws that were set by Congress were set into place in 1996 when the U.S. Congress passed the Telecommunications Act. And this act basically prevents local jurisdictions from prohibiting telecommunications services, including wireless services. 16 years later, in 2012, Congress passed another act that took aim at the review process and mandated that cities can't have discretionary review for projects that don't produce essentially a significant physical change in an existing facility. And then in 2014, the FCC then interpreted the 2012 Act by further defining what a substantial change meant. And then in addition, it set what are called shot clocks or deadlines for review. So basically what this means is when wireless applications are submitted, we are required by the FCC to act on them within certain time constraints. And any failure to act would require an issuance of all necessary permits without any further delay. And then, so the most recent order we have from the FCC was just made this past September 2018. And this last order was made due to the emerging technology that I mentioned previously and the widespread increase in the usage of the internet. So basically the FCC in 2018 ordered that micro or small cell wireless facilities that will soon be installed in a lot of jurisdictions, not just San Carlos, they required that they don't have any local regulatory barriers or no additional barriers than otherwise is set forth. And then the FCC set even shorter shot clocks for small cell wireless facilities. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. So essentially, we have 4 principal mandates. Cities can't prohibit wireless facilities from being installed. The FCC dictates the levels of acceptable radio frequency emissions from the facilities. We also are prohibited from having a discretionary review on existing facilities that propose minor changes to the physical dimensions of an existing facility. And then last, we have these shot clock deadlines for approving applications. So for an example, if a brand new facility was proposed, we have 150 days to act upon it. And then the shortest would be 90 days for 60 days for a small cell wireless facility that would be located on an existing support structure that's already in place. So again, we cannot outright deny wireless facilities based upon the laws that I just mentioned, but we do have some local control to address visual impacts to ensure that the best possible design and technology is used within our city. To address the shot clock mandates, what you'll find in the new ordinance is that applicants are required to submit applications to the building division at the same time they do planning. That way, it will help expedite the review process and ensure that these shot clock deadlines are met. In addition, the new ordinance will now require, in the past we've encouraged, but the new ordinance would require the applicant set up appointments with planning division staff so that we can review their application materials, make sure they have all the necessary submittal requirements, including a new provision that neighborhood outreach is done anytime a facility is proposed in a residential district. So that's something else that's new in the ordinance that's before you this evening. So as I mentioned before, what can cities do? Well, they can impose aesthetic requirements so long as they're reasonable, that they're no more burdensome than those applied to other infrastructure types, and that they're published in advance, meaning they're actually in the code. And our existing ordinance from 2011 already requires that the best available design and technology should be used from the industry as they're proposing wireless facilities in our jurisdiction. It also sets forth design and location standards and then ranks them by preference. And if a lower ranked option is used, we actually require the applicant to provide technical information to demonstrate why the higher ranked preference was not technically feasible. And so the new proposed ordinance, or the proposed ordinance that's before you this evening, continues to carry this forward, but adds in additional preferences for addressing the associated equipment and the cabinets that I mentioned. There's actually preferences in the ordinance now to ensure that that particular equipment is undergrounded to the extent it is feasible to do so. And then we also have additional impacts to avoid, additional screening to avoid and reduce visual impacts. So now I just wanted to touch upon some of the new technology that I mentioned. Some of you may be familiar with it or have heard about it, but I wanted to talk about it and then basically talk about how we're addressing that in our in the proposed ordinance. So there's this emerging technology which is often referred to as small cell wireless facilities, and there is a new section 1824-120 in the draft ordinance that's before you that addresses small cell wireless facilities. And small cells are generally defined as low-powered cellular radio access nodes and are deployed using far more nodes more densely spaced than macro facilities in order to meet capacity demands. And these types of facilities can be installed on light poles, on traffic lights, on utility poles, and other similar property in basically anywhere. It can be in a residential neighborhood. They can be in commercial and industrial areas as well. And so what's basically fueling this new technology is kind of the growth of the Internet of Things, which is an industry term used to describe wireless data transfer between a range of devices. Some of you are familiar with Nest, Alexa, Echo. There's keyless entry systems, our smartphones, and virtual reality, to the new and upcoming self-driving and automated cars. So all of these different types of technology are fueling the need for stronger and faster and service with improved connectivity. So the FCC recognized this, and last September they issued their new order, and we haven't had any applications submitted in San Carlos yet, but there have been wireless providers that have reached out to staff and are sort of waiting and seeing how our ordinance evolves, and we anticipate they will be submitting applications in the near future. As part of the proposed ordinance, the small cell facilities, because they're on on such a short time frame. They are proposed to be reviewed by the zoning administrator or by staff, given the very tight processing timelines. But again, for any wireless facility that's within a residential district, there is a neighborhood outreach provision required before they even submit. So just touching upon the aesthetic requirements that I mentioned before, like I mentioned, the new ordinance continues the theme of addressing design and location by rank preferences that our current 2011 zoning ordinance for wireless telecommunication systems already has. And this allows each site to find its best possible design rather than produce a requirement that's kind of like a one-size-fits-all. Every site is different, where the facility or the support structure might be is different. So we sort of have a preference for addressing, how each site should be approached. And so these are some of the aesthetic controls that you'll find in the proposed draft. Our preference is that, for example, that the facility be completely concealed within an existing structure. If it can't be, then it's away from the roof edge. Ideally, it's more than 600 feet away from a residential district. We are also recommending, as in our current ordinance, to co-locate, which basically means that where there's an existing support structure, a facility can go there, or where maybe there's an existing wireless facility, that another facility can co-locate with the existing one. We want these facilities to be concealed, to be painted to match in to the extent feasible. And then, like I mentioned before, what's new is that we're focusing on ensuring that ground-mounted equipment is located underground to the maximum extent feasible. Some of the findings for approval, because there are permits required to install a wireless facility, is that the facility be consistent with the general requirements and the design requirements that are outlined in the draft ordinance, be consistent with the general plan, that they comply with all safety codes and laws, that the facility does not interfere with the public's use of the right-of-way or create any undue risks, that the facility is compliant with all FCC radio frequency regulations and emission controls, that the facility avoids any adverse effect on a historic site or a building, that all the necessary permits are in place, including CEQA, if that should happen to be the case, and that we also are looking to make sure that alternative designs or locations were considered as part of the proposal. And any modification to any requirement of this chapter is in order to produce the best possible design and intrude the least on the particular site. So the notice for this particular item before you tonight was published in the local newspaper on January 31st. It was also noticed on the City of San Carlos social media Facebook page. And then as of this afternoon, staff did receive one comment letter from AT&T, which I believe the council has a copy of. And then other than that, the staff hasn't received any other comments on the proposed ordinance other than the one from AT&T. And this is the formal motion, should the council choose to make it. And like I mentioned before, both myself and Greg Rubens are here this evening to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Lisa. One just very quick procedural question. The formal motion language you have here, I presume it's identical to what we have on the sheet that is provided to us by Crystal? Or perhaps that's a question for Crystal.
I'll defer to the city clerk.
Yes, it looks to be the same.
Okay, thank you. Just because council members are likely to read that, because that's traditionally what we do. Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation. Excellent job as always. Questions from the dais? Ron, I see your light's on.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just a couple of questions. The macro facilities, like the one up on the hill, I know we have more than one. Mm-hmm. What happens to those? Do they go away? They get taken down?
Actually, I don't know. I mean, I think that's more of a question for maybe some of the experts in the telecommunications industry. As part of the proposed ordinance, it doesn't, affect any of the pre-existing facilities that are located in our jurisdiction. What I have learned in speaking to some of the wireless facilities, I think it's kind of in the long haul, where at some point in the future there would be enough of the small cell facilities evenly distributed throughout, where there wouldn't be a need for the larger macro macro facilities. But again, I think that's really far out. But my understanding is at some point down the line, that's the idea. So instead of having one very large facility, those would be removed, and there would be a lot of much more smaller small cell facilities spread throughout communities.
Thank you. That caused me to think of another issue that I believe we had. People were concerned about radio waves and that sort of thing from these large macro facilities, I guess, these installations is the word I was looking for. Is there a, and I don't know if that was an actual fact that there was a danger, but given, let's assume for a moment that it was, is having these small cells all over town, does that just diffuse the exposure, or does it reduce it for each one of these transmitters?
That's a really good question. What I can say is that even the small cell facilities will still be subject to the FCC RF emission controls. I don't know if there's a different standard for a small cell facility than the the macro cell facility. They do have certain standards in place, and the FCC sets those standards. So what we would be looking for in an application is documentation by licensed engineers, to basically show the anticipated level of RF emission as a result of a small cell, network. And then what's also required, and is part of the ordinance, is after the facilities are installed, applicants are required to submit an actual report. So after it's actually installed in operation, they're required to prepare another report and submit that to the city to verify that those standards and emission controls are in place and consistent with the FCC requirements. But I don't know the specific threshold for a small cell versus a macro cell. I don't have my hands that far deep into the wireless
I hadn't thought
controls.
about it until you started talking about that. So can multiple wireless providers use the same cell, or will Verizon have a few in this location and AT&T will have a few in another location?
Yeah, that's also a good question. So for the macro cell facilities, that's possible. And I think, as an example, the light pole at the park down the street on Burton Park may have 2 carriers, I think maybe 3 carriers on one city park pole. But for the small cell facilities, my understanding, at least for small cells that are being proposed on a PG&E pole, say for example, the PG&E basically sets a limit for how many carriers can be on a particular pole. And what I have learned through wireless telecommunication providers and some of the preliminary meetings I've had with them is that PG&E will allow only one. So on one utility pole would be one provider. And there are also requirements by PG&E that they not use an area, say if this is what the base of the pole all the way to the top, that they not use a certain area that's 7 feet, between 7 feet and I can't remember the uppermost, but that there be just essentially a vertical zone, if you will, where any additional equipment can be placed. The antenna has to be so many feet away from the top of the pole and away from a utility line. So there's some provisions that are set in place from PG&E that limit the amount of carriers on a pole and exactly where the equipment can go on that particular pole.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. I see this is going to be a good active discussion. All the lights are on. So, and I'm not sure who came on second, so I'm just going to start with Sarah.
Oh, wow. Lucky me. Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your presentation. I really like how thoughtful, the code has been worded to really look out for our community in ways like the neighborhood outreach, I think, is really important, and the location preferences with the 600 feet away from residential, the street light pole requirement. However, we got this letter from AT&T today, and a lot of the things that I really like about the code, they have serious issues with. So I'm wondering, Greg, do you have, before we kind of go down the rabbit hole and look at all of these, all the wording in the code, what is your perspective on the issues that they raise?
Well, I too received the same letter at the same time you did this afternoon, and I took some time this afternoon to look at our ordinance, refresh my recollection of what we're trying to accomplish with this. Stepping back for a second, I think the letter from AT&T, although it acknowledges somewhat our efforts, they have a difference of opinion on different provisions. However, my review of the ordinance and what we're trying to accomplish here is to be consistent with federal and state law with regard to antenna installations, especially the 5G rollout that's coming out that Lisa alluded to. The main, the history of the Telecommunications Act. I've been around doing this for a long time. I've had dozens of planning commission meetings where we've dealt with antenna installations in the past. And the big change that's happened is in 1996, cities had the ability to regulate aesthetics. We've always had the ability to regulate aesthetics. That act took away the electromagnetic radiation argument that was not an impermissible reason to deny an application. So for a long time, we haven't been able to consider that at all. We did have another provision in the act that allowed us to consider the provision of wireless services by measuring the signals in town, and we would routinely ask for coverage maps because the coverage map dictated whether or not that provider needed to have an antenna installation in that area. So they would bring us the maps and we would evaluate it. The code, the federal law and the state law back then when we were considering those maps just said provision of wireless services, so it didn't have the quality of service as a factor. So we were looking at the maps and we were saying, well, you have coverage there, so we didn't, I think we only did this one time, but we could deny a cell site based upon the coverage maps. The 2012 law took that away. We no longer have the discretion to look at the coverage because coverage now is under federal law includes all the services that we have on our phones now, the streaming video, the texting, all those things that the coverage maps the federal government deemed, I think, were inadequate to address that issue. So the more recent laws took that away. And then the industry said we were taking too long to consider the applications, and so then they've added the shot clocks to everything. So we only have limited time to consider depending on the complexity of the application as the federal government's deemed appropriate. So what we're left with is aesthetics. This ordinance that you have before you tonight is attempting to deal with aesthetics, community impacts, the look, the feel, the placement. Placement can't be related to the provision of the wireless service, but it can be based on whether it is inappropriate at a certain location. Unless, and there's exceptions in the code, unless when we look at the application, we can see that there's no other feasible location for an antenna. And we do have some geography in San Carlos, so that could happen. We could have a place where these microcells or cells need to be in a certain place because otherwise certain areas would not have the level of service or service. It's not just dropped calls anymore, it's the service that people are paying for when they sign up for a wireless provider. So I'm confident in the ordinance that we have before you. I looked at some of the issues, and I disagree with some of the conclusions that are stated in the letter. I have to point out that AT&T did not come here tonight. They sent a letter from Dallas, Texas, to criticize our efforts to comply with the federal law, but I'm confident that the ordinance before you is compliant with the federal law and the local regulation.
I'm going to interrupt you just for a second because I only noticed this when I was looking at the speaker slips. There actually is a speaker who basically says they're from Lighthouse Public Affairs, AT&T via Lighthouse Public Affairs. So
okay, well I stand corrected. Somebody's here from AT&T. It's not the same person who wrote the letter, but it is someone from AT&T. And so again, I'm confident that our ordinance does comply with standards and the local regulation that we're entitled to have on aesthetics, and has provisions that are objective and allow us to evaluate the aesthetics, because you can't just evaluate aesthetics in a vacuum. You need to have some information to evaluate aesthetics. That includes such things as community, neighborhood, who are very more familiar with the neighborhood than staff might be. We'd like to know what the neighborhood thinks about a particular location of an installation. Now, it's our job to evaluate whether or not it's that there are other feasible alternatives, or that is the only location that is appropriate. But those are the types of things that I think are allowed under the law. And I might add that Kai, my partner who helped draft the ordinance, looked at a whole bunch of other ordinances, and local cities have adopted very similar ordinances to the ones that you have. I mean, I just today, in the limited time that I had, I looked at San Mateo's ordinance that was adopted last year, very similar to the ordinance that we are putting forward for adoption for you tonight.
Sarah, other questions? Okay. Laura.
Thank you, Chair Olbert. Thank you very much for the presentation, Lisa. So a question around the fact that my understanding is that 5G is supposed to start to come online in 2019 and into 2020. Do we have a sense in terms of kind of the magnitude or the number of installations that we might expect, and when providers are going to want to start to install?
Sure, I can share some information that I have. What I do have, I'll share. Staff has met with representatives from Verizon, and they're currently looking at installing 23 small cell facilities. So these would be 23 individual small cell facilities located in some of the residential neighborhoods, with a few areas across the highway into the eastern, more industrial area of the city. So they are currently met with us a couple of times, have shared a preliminary map to show the locations that they're looking at. We explained to them that we're in the process of updating our ordinance, that in the residential areas this is something new, and the ordinance is going to likely require some neighborhood outreach. And they commented that they basically didn't have any issue with that. They would be happy to work with us. And so they're just sort of on standby. And I expect that once this ordinance is adopted, they will be submitting some applications to at least move forward with some sites in the industrial area, and then later batch some of the small cell sites in some of the residential neighborhoods subsequently.
And just one quick follow-up question. And then are there any, my understanding is that there's larger boxes that need to be installed to support these smaller cells. Could you just talk about that a little bit, and how many of those might be implicated, for example, in this Verizon example?
At least, yeah, and thank you for asking that follow-up question, because one of the things I failed to mention, and it's a detail, one of our concerns, a staff concern, is that all of these boxes are going to be located on the ground, with more sites, more boxes. And so that's why we drafted provisions to require that these cabinets be undergrounded to the maximum extent, that it's technically feasible. In discussion with Verizon, their staff explained to us that in their proposal, they wouldn't need to have any ground-mounted equipment. And it's just that the technology that they happen to be using, Verizon happens to be using, will not require any cabinets as part of their proposal. So we were happy to hear that, but I can't speak to other providers or what type of technology they may be using. But at least with the Verizon proposal, my expectation is that when they do submit, we will not be seeing the cabinets, equipment cabinets, in conjunction with their application. That's what they've explained to us anyway.
Adam.
Thank you. Lisa, thanks for the presentation. So I had a couple of questions. One, let me just start with on the aesthetic requirements. You talked about the PG&E issue with sort of they have some control over co-location. But assuming that if Verizon, AT&T, whoever else was looking at small cell placements, that would be valid for other facilities, other areas they want to put it on a building, some other city property or somewhere else, that we could sort of include that as a aesthetic requirement. Is that right? I mean, I know PG&E is probably the easy way to go, but I mean, I'd love to see less of, 4 different carriers in a row if we can.
Right. I know less about, I don't know if this is something that our city attorney may happen to know. I know that for, like you mentioned, on a utility pole, there's only one wireless provider on each utility pole. If a small cell facility was to locate, I think your question was on a building, and maybe T-Mobile goes there, then AT&T, and then Verizon, and then you have this little cluster of small cells on a building. Are there any controls to that? I have to defer to the city attorney to see if there's any standards, but I'm not aware of any.
Someone want to put on City Hall.
Well, City Hall is our building, so it would require our consent still, fortunately, under the law. But I think let's just say there's a certain building. I think we already have such a building. The AT&T building in downtown San Carlos has multiple cell sites on it. That would be considered a co-location facility, so we would have to consider additional antennas on that building, presuming somebody proposed them. As far as, I think I might have heard you say this, but correct me if this wasn't really part of your question, is do we have the ability to say, I'll just shortcut it, here, but not there? As far as different locations for an antenna installation.
Right, because in terms of the ranking for preferences, as you talked about the requirements, does that can we play some role in that if the option is a PG&E pole versus another facility or something that might be better for co-location?
We do. The code is designed to have, correct me if I'm wrong, Lisa, but it has some criteria and preferences for locations as far as zoning districts, and as well as different types of locations. And I think it is encouraging co-locations. I mean, that's one of our things, but if it's on a PG&E pole, and that's the proposal, and that's probably in many cases what we would have to have. But if there is if there's an alternative location that is higher up on our preferences, that's the thing that I think gives us, and it has to be based on aesthetics, because I think that's what our main thrust is with this ordinance. If one location is better than another from an aesthetic standpoint, staff would probably be recommending that location.
And then the second question, I just want to refer back to the AT&T letter where they discuss, I just want to pull it up here, the neighborhood outreach proof, where they're objecting to that piece, saying that, which I think it's fine to have neighborhood outreach. More of the question for the city staff and others, if AT&T is arguing that the FCC shot clock would start once you sort of hit a public outreach period, how does that affect our ability to go through the process and approve that? Is there concern that we wouldn't have enough time given some of these other areas, that maybe a 60-day window or something like that, or a 90-day window?
Well, that's one of the arguments that I disagree with. The shot clock comes from an application date, not from what our code requires. There's nothing preventing somebody from filing an application also, and we would deem it not complete, and then they could complete that part of the requirements too. So it's they're not tied to a sequencing necessarily if they just apply, and then we tell them it's not a complete application until you do the outreach.
Great, thank you.
Ron.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just, I thought of a couple others, sorry. Could they put up their own poles?
Sure, yes. I would imagine they could, although in our code we have preferences that they would be located on a street light, kind of is the first preference, and then it kind of continues on from there. But there would be nothing to prevent them from, if there was no existing support structure, no utility pole, no building, or no other support mechanism that's available, they could indeed propose their own support structure.
And would they be paying rent to PG&E or to us if they put them on our streetlights?
They would be to the city, so on any city facility, if it's whether it's a structure or the owner of a support or some sort of support like a street light, they need to obtain a license to use the structure from the city before they can apply to to receive their permit from planning, and they have to pay fees for licensings and an annual fee for such use. But I'll defer to the city attorney. I think there were some new provisions in the recent law that limits the amount of fees, annual fees that would be required to be paid to the city.
That's one of the new rulings and new law that they've actually reached from Washington to tell us exactly the most we can charge for one of these co-locations that's on a city-owned pole. And then on the issue of the pole, that they might propose a pole to hold a microcell, that would, under the ordinance, it's one of the lower preferences to allow that type of pole to be installed, because there's usually some other place that it could be located, and we don't want to encourage for aesthetic reasons, poles located randomly throughout the town that are not, that there hasn't historically been a pole in that location, and people generally, that's just more street clutter and street furniture that we don't need.
Right.
In many cases.
Okay. Last question. You were going through these aesthetic requirements, and you said something located more than 600 feet away from residential districts. Well, if we're putting these things all over town, are you referring to like a large structure or something?
Yeah, that's just a general preference. It's not a mandatory requirement. So when a small cell needs to go into, say, a residential neighborhood, it's not like a regular, like a 15-foot front yard setback that you have to meet. It's just a series of preferences. And if you can't meet that preference, you just move on to the next. But that is a carryover, but we still have it in the existing ordinance from our current 2011 ordinance, which generally applies to the larger macro facilities. And again, even for macro, that's a preference, because in some instances, say for example, over up on Shelford and Buckland on the Cal water tank facility or that particular site, there are some wireless telecommunication providers there. They're certainly within 600 feet of our district.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. I think I'm done.
That's what you said last time. Adam.
Sorry, I had one last question because of Ron's question. And I know I asked about trying to co-locate, but if you're looking at city, let's say in a small cell on putting it on streetlights or something, do we have the ability to limit the number on a particular light for safety reasons or for aesthetic reasons? I mean, could we have four boxes on a single street pole?
For aesthetics reasons and for engineering reasons, I mean, let's hypothetically, we'll say there's a city pole somewhere in town and we get a proposal to put three antennas on it. Well, from an engineering standpoint, our city engineer might say that pole can't handle that much on it, so we would say no, and I think we would be justified using our police power and based on health and safety findings. As far as aesthetics, I think we would have the same rule, and primarily what the federal government gives us, we look at aesthetics, and clutter is one of the elements of aesthetics. I think that would justify not allowing that kind of a multiple of installations on one pole.
All right, I'm done now.
That's fine. And by the way, just to be clear, I was only joking. I think it's great when questions spark questions, because it's not as if we all think of everything we're going to think of before we come into this chamber. So I have some questions, which, Lisa, I'm going to direct to you, but they may not all be within your bailiwick, so Greg and whoever, feel free to chime in. Let me start with, the primary impetus for us being here tonight addressing this issue is because of the small cell technology that we're accommodating. I'd just like to understand if there were any significant changes to the rules that govern the larger scale facilities if somebody were to say, hey, we want to install a larger scale facility like the ones we used to put in. Has that, Greg, you described the evolution of things over time. Does the most recent change in legislation, did they change that as well? Or
They did. They put a 150-day shot clock on a new tower.
Okay.
That we still have to evaluate it. And they did take away the provision, like I said before, of or the strength of the signal discussion. That was a change that is the same as all the other installations. And then there's changes to co-location. The government, federal government's recognizing that co-locations are a different category, and the shot clock is shorter on those. But we still, again, have the aesthetic issue on all of these types of installations.
Okay. I misunderstood you earlier. I thought some of those changes were for earlier rounds of stuff, but that's fine. I appreciate you clarifying. So we've had a little bit of discussion tonight about the impact of potential multiple poles being erected in an area or multiple devices going into an area. When I read the ordinance, the new proposed ordinance, it seemed to imply to me that there was a possibility that if the geometry of the town was such that every carrier needed to have a microcell tower or microcell unit in some particular area, and PG&E comes along now and says, well, you can only put one on top of the pole there. There was this sort of approach where a carrier, if you couldn't find an existing thing to put the technology on, they could erect their own pole. That was one of the preferences, I think, sort of a lower level preference. It struck me that there actually, embedded in there was almost the possibility that you could have multiple poles going up in the same area, each one with a different carrier, because PG&E says, well, we can only put one on top of on this pole here, and everybody's like, well, I got to put my unit here, okay? And it's probably outside of our purview because that's not aesthetics. They're sort of technically saying, no, it needs to be like right here. And so what I was wondering is it possible to tweak this so that if a special purpose pole gets erected, it has to be able to support multiple microcell installations to prevent that kind of thing from happening?
I think it's possible to do that. Our policy does encourage, where appropriate, the co-locations. So I think that is possible to do that.
And that might be enough, you're saying right there, just to say the policy ordinance is designed to encourage this, so we're not just going to let you erect a second pole. Or
I think it's going to be one of those things when we look at the first time this happens, we're going to gather some information about the possibility of requiring that as a condition. And a lot of times the carriers want to have something like that because it mitigates the cost of the installation.
Fair enough.
And we're probably talking about a pole that looks like a streetlight pole, and to carry a microcell, it's not a big tower. It's something a little smaller than that. But the exact location of the pole, I think we still have under aesthetics some discretion. Put it over here where it's not blocking a view, or put it in another area where it's not near a playground or something. I mean, if it happens to be in that kind of a location. And my understanding of the technology, and the AT&T representative can correct me, but is a lot of this is driven by the density of the users. So a lot of poles are required around Levi Stadium, and a lot of nodes are required there because they have to be able to accommodate 70,000 people all at once using their devices. And we don't have that situation in San Carlos, so we don't need that level of density, but there might be places in town, and I've been told near the 101 freeway corridor, that higher density is required.
I see. Well, perhaps I can just leave it as something for staff to keep an eye on if it becomes an issue to address, because it sounds like there are ways we can do this. Yeah, I understand what you're talking about with multiple, density stuff. I understand, like, Adam's house is going to have stuff all over it because of all the consumption he does of high bandwidth things. But
I'll get paid for it.
That's how you're financing your reconstruction. There you go. The other question I had was, we are proposing here basically a total rewrite of one code section and the elimination of another. Okay, I got that. I tried to go through with sort of doing a compare and contrast of the rewritten one, because the policy, that code section covers quite a bit more than just microcells. I mean, it covers a lot of different things. So I tried to go through and say, gee, did anything else change outside of the microcell stuff, and were there any significant things there? I'm not sure I caught everything. Is there any advice staff could give me? I mean, I'd almost like ideally, to me, it would have been nice to have some kind of, if not red line, because the thing would have been all crossed out, but something that said, here are the major things we eliminated, here are the major things we added, and here's the actual full text. So, but can you perhaps summarize it for me?
Well, I'll start. As a general rule of thumb, the existing ordinance of 2011, a lot of what's in there was carried forward into the proposed ordinance that's before you this evening. Okay. However, some of it was reorganized because the flow of the information just kind of wasn't very user-friendly. So we wanted to clean that up. So as part of our consultation with the deputy city attorney, we said, can we move some things around so it just kind of flows more logically in terms of the requirements and the permit procedures. So what was in the 2011 ordinance, our existing ordinance, was carried forward, a bit reorganized, and then some additional sections were added in order to, catch up to the new acts and FCC rulings and regulations that were made. So it's more robust than the previous one, and updated to have those provisions within it, within the new act and the FCC rulings within it.
Okay, fair enough.
As a general rule of thumb,
okay.
Right.
One of the main additions is adding the shot clock periods, because that didn't exist in 2011, and it does. So we've incorporated that in this code.
Okay, that one I had noticed, but you never know what you don't notice, right? So that's the problem. All right. Any other questions? Nobody else's lights are on. So I actually have a procedural question for Jeff and Greg, because it's been a while since I did this. This is a public hearing. Do I do public comment before I close the public hearing, or do I close the public hearing now?
Yes, you would invite the public to speak, and then make sure when you're out of slips, you make sure that there's no one else that wants to speak on the item, and then you can solicit a motion. Okay,
thank you. I have one speaker card here, and as Greg just said, from a Richard Hackman. And if there's anybody else who wishes to address the council on this item, please let us know and fill out a slip for Crystal. Richard, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mayor and City Council. I also want to thank staff for your work on this as well. My name is Richard Hackman. I'm with Lighthouse Public Affairs, and we are a consultant working with AT&T. They apologize they weren't able to be here tonight, but did want me to attend. So you all received the letter, and it was a number of pages long, and in there they highlighted some of the key issues that they wanted to bring up. And more than anything, they just really wanted to convey the fact that now 70% of the country relies on small cell infrastructure for either their primary phone, their only phone, or for most of their phone usage. So while we recognize there's always a need to address concerns about aesthetics and health and ensuring that a community maintains its identity, what we also want to convey is that there's a great demand within the city for these services, and we ask that the ordinances that be implemented try to the best of their ability to ensure that applications can not only be done in a way that the city supports them, but in a way that encourages the installation of these sites, because they really are something that we all depend on, for the use of our smartphones, and going forward in the future, really almost everything that we'll be utilizing as a community. So our request for you tonight was the opportunity to pause this discussion and meet with AT&T on the proposed ordinance to discuss some of the components that are in there. And in particular, we wanted to discuss with you the number of discretionary items. We think that this ordinance is heavy on discretion, and that is counter to the state and federal law, which you all discussed previously. So thank you for your time, and if you have any additional questions, I'm happy to answer to the best of my ability.
Thank you, Richard. Appreciate that. Is there anybody else who wishes to address the council on this item? Seeing nobody stepping forward, I'll entertain a motion to close the public hearing.
I move to close the public hearing. Let's see if there's a...
Actually, that's it.
That's all you need to do.
That's the simplest motion you can make.
That's
Is
why
there-
Ron gave me the nod to do that one. I figured I couldn't mess it up, and I did.
I'll second that. Excellent motion.
There's a motion and a second. Well done and seconded. Crystal, actually discussion, or I don't think we actually discuss, right? Crystal, would you call the roll, please?
Councilmember Palmer Lohan?
We're closing.
Voting to close the public hearing.
Closing the public hearing.
Oh,
It's a two-step process when you have a public hearing.
yes.
Councilmember McDowell?
Yes.
Councilmember Olbert?
Yes.
Councilmember Collins?
Yes.
Councilmember Rack?
Yes.
All right, the motion carries. Public hearing is closed. Now we are to the phase of discussion and potentially acting on something. Would somebody either like to make a motion or begin discussion?
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
We had a request from the speaker that we pause this discussion, I think he said, and consult with AT&T. Well, that kind of came out of left field. I don't know how to respond to that.
Well, it was in their letter, basically, that requesting the council not act on the introduction of the ordinance tonight and then have a discussion with staff and AT&T. And we're not recommending that tonight. We think the ordinance is legally adequate. Other providers did not have the same complaints, and as I said before, this ordinance is very similar to ordinances that other cities on the peninsula have enacted. So we're confident in the ordinance, and we recommend that you introduce it. Now, that doesn't mean that if AT&T wants to reach out to me, I'm glad to talk with them. They sent a letter, at the last minute, and I haven't had a chance to talk with anyone about it. And if they want to discuss it with me, I'm glad to do it, but we're recommending that you introduce it tonight, and then it'll come up for adoption at a future meeting.
Laura.
Yeah, so my take on it, I did have a chance to read the AT&T letter in advance, and what's striking to me is I'm getting kind of a different take from Verizon. Lisa had suggested that they were very willing to work with us, and when I did the read of the AT&T letter, it seemed to me that there would be really very little left over if we were to accept all of their recommended changes for us to have any local control. And I would agree that I think, for example, public notice for the community, especially given the fact that some of these small cells are going to be going into residential areas potentially. And it sounds like not just a few, but there could be quite a lot given the way that technology is going these days. So I would like us to just make sure that, we maintain the aesthetics as much as we can of our community, as well as some of the safety issues that were brought up tonight.
Thank you, Laura. Any other comments, or does somebody want to introduce a motion? After which we, of course, can continue discussion. I don't mean to say that that's cut off.
I'm just pointing at Laura. Go ahead. I'm just saying, go ahead.
Oh, okay. So is it, Greg, to your point, is it possible for us to introduce the ordinance and, like you had suggested, perhaps go ahead and have that call with AT&T just to see if there's any suggestions from them that we'd be willing to adopt in this? I mean, otherwise I feel like there's not much left for us to.
No, from time to time, after new information has come in, after the council's introduced an ordinance, and then all that's required, if there happened to be a change that staff was willing to recommend, would be to reintroduce the ordinance, and then you'd adopt it at a meeting after that.
Okay. All right. Okay. All right. So I'd like to move that the City Council introduce ordinance. Do I make a motion? I'm sorry. I'm confused about what you're asking
That's
me.
okay. That's okay. If you look at this sheet.
I wasn't able to read Ron's.
That's
Yes. Okay. I move to introduce ordinance number
1539.
An ordinance of the City Council of the City of San Carlos amending San Carlos Municipal Code Title 18, zoning, consisting of modifications to Chapter 18.24, wireless telecommunications facilities, and rescinding Chapter 1232, wireless telecommunications facilities.
Is there a second?
Second.
There is a motion and a second. I'll just make the observation. See, Laura, we have those things written out because you probably thought before you joined the council that we were just really brilliant and could come up with the stuff on the fly, but that's why we have these written out, because we actually can't do that. So motion and second, is there any discussion? Seeing none, then I will call the roll. Crystal.
Councilmember Olbert?
Yes.
Councilmember Palmer-Lohan?
Yes.
Councilmember McDowell?
Yes.
Councilmember Rack?
Yes.
And Councilmember Collins?
Yes.
All right. I had one last thing that I wanted to bring up with my colleagues that relates to this item, but it's really more direction for staff, not about the motion per se. Granted, there was, as Lisa explained to us, no commentary coming in from the public about this. I can tell you in years past, the siting of macro cell phone towers and systems had generated a fair amount of local neighborhood concern. So I feel that we ought to direct staff in an appropriate forum, perhaps in the next quarterly newsletter or whatnot, to explain what's happened here, so that not so much to pass the buck to the feds in the state, but just to explain what's happened, so that when folks see this process unfolding and microcell towers being installed around the community, they understand that it's all in accordance with federal, state, and local regulations. So does that sound a reasonable thing to do? Anybody have any objection to that?
No, I think it's a good idea.
Good idea.
All right, thank you. Jeff, okay, got that.
Be happy to do that.
Great. Then we will move on to the next item, which is new business, item 9A, consideration of adopting resolution approving the citywide wayfinding study and authorizing staff to proceed with engaging a qualified professional services firm to complete the necessary design and engineering. Al.
Good evening once again, Honorable Chair, members of the City Council. In November 2016, the City Council authorized the city staff to enter into a contract with Hunt Design to begin the preparation of a citywide wayfinding program in concept. And so after a rigorous process in developing this concept and program, we are ready to present it to the City Council this evening. And so to present this material to you, Adam Aronson, our Economic Development Coordinator, will be doing the presentation, and then we have Emily Machida, who is a senior designer with Hunt Design. And so with that, Adam.
Good evening, Adam.
Good evening, Honorable Chair, members of the Council. So to help frame tonight's presentation, we have highlighted here the items that we are seeking the Council's direction on. This is including approval of the citywide wayfinding study and a decision whether to move forward with the gateway signage. Now, if the Council would like to move forward with the gateway signage, then we would like your input on two options that are available. So in 2016, as Al mentioned, City Council approved a resolution authorizing a contract with Hunt Design to conduct a citywide wayfinding study and develop a program for directional signage and gateways throughout the city. Since then, city staff and Hunt Design have worked with community representatives to develop a signage program which we'll be presenting tonight. This review process first included the development of a steering committee made up of representatives from the Economic Development Advisory Commission, the Transportation Circulation Commission, the Planning Commission, the San Carlos School District, and city staff. After this, a public meeting was held to gather further feedback on initial designs and help frame the process moving forward. As the wayfinding study evolved, presentations were next given to the Economic Development Advisory Commission, followed by the Transportation and Circulation Commission. Most recently, the study was presented to the City Council's Downtown Subcommittee, including Councilmembers Adam Rack and Laura Palmer-Lohan. At this time, the subcommittee requested additional drawings of some of the gateway signs, which will be seen in the following slides, and also expressed a preference for digital map kiosks as opposed to static ones in the downtown area. And throughout all of these meetings, there's been a general consensus in support of the wayfinding program. The steering committee is now recommending approval of the wayfinding program and to begin development of design intent fabrication and installation drawings so that quotations can be collected for the production and installation of the signs. With that, I would like to introduce Emily Morishita with Hunt Design, who has been leading the design process and will now walk us through the work that has been done so far.
Good evening, Emily. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mayor and members of the council. I'm really happy to be here. This project has been really near and dear to us at Hunt Design, so I'm happy to be here to represent Hunt Design. So starting out, in the City Wayfinding Program, our project goals were to direct and orient users to main destinations, guide first-time visitors to destinations effectively, really to help improve the flow of traffic, and with that, to get drivers parked near destinations, so parking signs are included in this program, and out of their cars to ease congestion, support circulation between destinations for all users, so this means drivers, cyclists, and pedestrians, and to unify and refresh public signage throughout the city for residents and visitors, and really to establish a cohesive wayfinding system. So below those goals are some of the sign types that we've developed and that you'll see in this program tonight, from city gateways to motorist directional signs, parking identification signs, and then signs for cyclists and pedestrians. So going back to the start of the program, really what we do at Hunt Design is to be inspired by the city and by the members of the steering committee. So, within the city of San Carlos, you have the Hiller Aviation Museum. You have really a range of landscape from the hills to the water. And it's really a family-friendly community with different festivals, lots of parks, and a lot of community events. We're also inspired by the landscape and the architecture and Laurel Street itself and the downtown area. And then we also really take stock of what San Carlos looks like in terms of existing gateway signage, pedestrian signage, park signage. So these are some of the photos that we've taken, as well as from looking at Google and driving around and really exploring the city and getting to know the city. We also are not just graphic designers, but as wayfinding specialists, we are familiar with the MUTCD guidelines for motorists. For this project, we're given the City of Good Living, San Carlos brand guidelines. So that really helped to inform us as far as the starting point for the look and feel, the colors of the city, and the City of Good Living tagline for the city as well. So we also look at working very closely with the steering committee what these destinations are for San Carlos for both motorists and pedestrians. So you can see some of these listed as far as civic destinations. You have the airport and the Caltrain train station, and then lots of parks and community centers. And as Adam mentioned, this goes back to subcommittee meetings, site work, design revisions that were based on our meetings and design presentations to that subcommittee, public meetings, a sign location review reviewed by city staff, and the other meetings that Adam mentioned, economic development. At that time, we also had full-size mock-ups made that we placed within the city so that we can really see it from both a driver and a pedestrian's perspective. That led to other design revisions and presentations to the Transportation and Circulation Commission and City Council tonight. So we looked at first where those destinations are located, and something very specific to San Carlos was this idea that you have the downtown area on Laurel Street with retail and dining, a very popular dining destination, and then this idea that both South Laurel and the Industrial Arts District are more emerging neighborhoods or districts that could be destinations in themselves in the future. So we mapped out and worked with the subcommittee to look at routes into downtown, into the heart of San Carlos. And where those yellow circles are would be potential gateway areas as people approach the city. So those are the typical sign types that we were looking at for San Carlos. And very early on, we worked through different design iterations with the wayfinding subcommittee. So we had various options. We really worked with them to talk about this idea of both sort of a very high-tech community and yet a Main Street community, you know, a small downtown, a very walkable community. And so it was sort of this mix of something that had very modern, a clean look, but then also had designs on the back that sort of had this more classical graphic elements that also harked to the architectural elements of the city. So these are some photos from our mock-up review. We had full-size mock-ups of both the motorist directionals and pedestrian directionals. And for the motorist directionals, this is one of the designs that we were working with the committee and moving forward with. So you have San Carlos highlighted at the bottom of the front of the sign, and then a decorative element on the back of the sign. We have directionals to parking and identification signs for the public parking. And then bicyclist directional signs on the left, also featuring downtown, and pedestrian directionals, a map kiosk, and what we're calling a placemaking sign, something that would be attached to existing street lights, street posts. So this is a close-up of the map kiosk, which could be featured on Laurel Street and have a walking radius to really let people know what's around that area and how long it would take to get to a destination like the train station. This is a slide showing the bicyclist directional sign. And then we really kind of had fun with this, taking the branding guidelines that were given to us in the different colors and looking at a way to feature the City of Good Living tagline on street banners. Here's a photo rendering of what that could look like. And then also taking this idea of having placemaking cuffs throughout downtown. So it could be the City of Good Dining, the City of Parks, the City of Good Living, and a photo representation of what that could look like. And then we looked very closely at gateway elements to the city. So here's an existing gateway, and looking at an option of taking the graphic language that's shown on the back of the directional signs and having that as a vertical element within the median to feature San Carlos. And then looking at taking that same design but changing the colors. So that would be option B. And a close-up, we did a SketchUp mock-up to show that really these are dimensional letters housed within a painted aluminum frame structure. And there could be landscaping that would grow up the back of that structure. Then we have the existing gateway that's on San Carlos Avenue. And taking that element, and this would be seen from both sides of the structure, San Carlos and the City of Good Living. And option B is a color shift with the brighter gold. Then we have an existing horizontal gateway. And one thing that we looked at, this is option A, is taking some of those same architectural elements from the existing gateway that was shown on this slide here and attaching it to this structure to create that cohesiveness between the existing gateway and then the retrofitting this gateway as well. Option B would be to leave the structure mostly intact, but to include a horizontal City of San Carlos dimensional letters and framing element. And then existing, as you're approaching on Holly Street, really this is from the 101, one of the main entry points into the city, into downtown. So we wanted to feature highlighting San Carlos on this existing structure. And option B would be a color shift that would be closer to the branding guidelines that were given to us. So here we have, as far as the gateway elements go, option A and an option B, very similar but different colorways throughout those two options. And the sign family seen as a whole on this last slide here. So you can see the sign family has now been filled out with the motorist directional signs, parking signs, pedestrian signs, and bicyclist signs. But I wanted to bring it back to this slide, which shows the two options for the gateway signage. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emily. Appreciate that. Questions from the dais? Gee, you guys came in simultaneously. Adam.
Thank you for the presentation. That's great. I appreciate it. And thank you also. I know we had the subcommittee meeting, just kind of adding a couple slides, put some context in, I think, for me at least, some of the visuals. So I appreciate you adding those for the presentation. And so I guess, and maybe in terms of some of the areas I think we talked about at the subcommittee meeting were to make sure we kind of expand kind of where we're looking at for some of these directional signs, because I think we have some other, we sort of went for a limited scope within the parks as an example to try and expand those to some of the open space parks and some of the other parks that may be less accessible so that people can to do that as well. And then I guess I didn't see on there and on your list, and I maybe forgot at the meeting we had, but the San Carlos History Museum, I didn't see anything listed for that. I saw Hiller, but we also have our own small history museum. So I think, and I know we're just looking at sort of approving the concepts of it, but I want to make sure we sort of look at how expansive we want to make this in terms of really sort of being a full wayfinding opportunity for us. I guess it's more of a comment than questions.
Mm-hmm. That's fine. Ron.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is not actually for Emily. Actually, it's for staff. So under the fiscal implications, it says that we've already approved $100,000 for this project. But then it says in the next paragraph that there would the additional cost, design, construction, installation is $240,000. What part of the budget does that come out of, and do we have an allocation for it?
It would be a general fund expenditure, and you don't currently have an allocation for it.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Other questions? Sarah.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to get a little background. I see here in the packet that the subcommittee, when you guys met, there was discussion about doing a digital map kiosk. What would that look like, and where would that be, and how does that work?
Well, at the time, and here you see second to the right is that map kiosk. So the kiosk itself is designed to either be a static map, double-sided, or the size is based on including a digital screen within that framework. I think that, our recommendation at Hunt Design, we've right now have located this sign right in Laurel Street at the park that's on Laurel Street downtown, because there really aren't a lot of downtown areas that have a park situated within the downtown area at that scale. And so we thought that that location would be a good point for a meeting point. But we also feel like in terms of having a digital screen, it really has to be closely looked at as to what that content is and who would be managing that content, how often that content would be changed out. Our recommendation is actually for a static map that would be easier to be changed out because so many people are on their phones, they have map devices, they're able to look up the area that or the destination they're trying to get to at that level, just in terms of the cost associated with those digital screens.
Thank you. I have one follow-up question too, if that's okay. So the design with the teal kind of waves in the background, I assume that is the design, right, for San Carlos? Do we have ownership of that design? I want to make sure that we don't see that popping up in San Mateo next or Palo Alto, that it's unique to our city. How do we guarantee that?
Well, we have created that specifically for San Carlos, inspired by both the landscape and the architecture that exists right now. So it would be part of the construction documentation for the wayfinding program of San Carlos. And then once it's rolled out into the streets and into the landscape, it would become associated with San Carlos.
I can add that I'd have to look at it, but there may be a way to copyright some of the images. I mean, that would be I think the mechanism for protecting that.
I think my questions I'm not sure exactly who they're directed to, so I know some of them at least are going to be Adam as well as Emily and maybe Jeff. Building on the discussion that you briefly had with Ron, the scope of the $240,000, is that for this next phase of design phase, or does that start covering some of the actual construction of the signs?
$240,000 amount, that is for the installation, the construction and the installation of the signs. That's not for the design phase. That would be a smaller amount for probably around $40,000 or $50,000.
So I want to make sure I understand. So $240,000 buys all of and ignoring the various options, but it buys all of the signage that we're seeing examples of tonight?
Yes, that's correct, with some options here and there.
I'm impressed. I didn't think you could do that for $240,000. Okay, thank you. Some other questions that I had, sort of more relating to the design of the signage per se. And I'll freely admit I am not a branding person and a design person. I mean, part of this, what I realized tonight, is that I tended to think of the wayfinding study as mostly like signage pointing where to get to various places. To me, actually, most of what you've described here tonight is not so much that, it's branding. It's branding for the city, which I'm not saying I'm necessarily opposed to, but it's sort of different in my mind than wayfinding. The first question I sort of had is, on the one hand, I like the signage designs for the wayfinding that you've proposed and the options and whatnot, but they are, how can I put this? Except when they use the catchphrase City of Good Living, there's nothing unique about San Carlos to them. And I was wondering, did you consider, is it from a design point of view possible to, for example, put some of those iconic images, perhaps of the structure that's at the corner of San Carlos Avenue or the train station or something, kind of in outline form in the background, so that when one looks at the sign, it may be saying, here's how you get to the parking lot, but you know that you're in San Carlos and you're seeing a San Carlos related sign.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think two things to that. One could be that those street banner designs that we showed could be modified to include, either architectural elements or other photographic representations of San Carlos. But with the wayfinding sign program, what we wanted to do was take inspiration from the architecture and from elements of San Carlos, the destinations themselves, but really to sort of merge that into, in this case, more of an illustrative, decorative backside.
I see that, and I guess maybe what we're coming down to is, and you're the designer, not me, I guess, as I said, they're nice-looking designs, but I could see them showing up in Burlingame or Menlo Park or any one of a number of communities on the peninsula, and I go, yeah, okay, they fit in. And so that's what I meant about there's nothing that sort of uniquely ties it back to San Carlos, except when we say City of Good Living, because that's our motto. Mm-hmm. All right, well, I'll think about that. That may sort of affect my my reaction to moving forward. The location map, I too had the sort of thought about that Sarah expressed about going with a more digital approach. But you actually raised, I thought, or reminded me of a very important thing, which is that do they actually serve much purpose anymore for a growing proportion of the population? As you yourself said, we're looking at our phones to figure out where we're going, not actually going to look at a map kiosk. So how common are they anymore for people newly installed? I mean, I can see if a community had them for a while, they'd keep them, but how often are they done nowadays as a new installation?
As a static map, or I think it does depend on the area itself. We actually work with quite a lot of cities where the static maps are in place because there are walking or, walkable or bikeable destinations close to that area. And then, it also depends on the amount of tourists or residents who may not know about certain destinations. So there are cities that really want to promote, say, a newly developed walking trail or a park that's opened up, or to help encourage walking and biking. So we found a resurgence, I think, of some of these map kiosks and static maps.
So those are good points. Thank you for that information. That makes me think, perhaps I was wrong. I was assuming that since you had, in your pictures, your renderings had located the map in the heart of our downtown area, that most of what was going to be on the map was almost like what you'd see in an old American mall where it would say, here's the town restaurant, here's the this restaurant, here's the this store. But it almost sounds from your answer a minute ago that it's more like, here's the bike trail, here's a walking trail, here's the San Carlos History Museum. So what's the scope or focus of the map?
Well, in this case, and thinking about it, it could also be closer to the train station because it could encourage people once they're at the train station to, branch out and go further down Laurel Street than they thought that they might be able to get to in the time that they have in the city. I mean, for that case, it's for visitors. But part of what we do as wayfinding designers, it's also these signage programs really give a sense of sort of the cohesiveness of the city, how things are maintained. I mean, that sort of falls back to the branding element where it's a sense of sort of security, a sort of look, a feeling that the city is invested in this look in the wayfinding and signage program.
I appreciate that. I'm having a little difficulty. Let me see if I can narrow the question down, at least one part of it. Is it proposed, is staff recommending that the signage, the map, would in fact, for example, list the locations of various private sector stores, restaurants, or whatever, or would it be public things that would be referenced on it, or both? I'd just like to get an answer to that because I'm trying to understand it.
So I would say at this point, we're more at a phase of we're accepting recommendations for what exactly people want on the map, whether that's businesses or parks on the map. It's more we just have the general design and location that we're looking at right now. And if you want us to go a certain direction where we looked more into making it an interactive map with businesses that's constantly being updated, we could do that. Or if you'd rather it be more focused on certain sites in the downtown area, we could do that as well.
Okay, thank you. I'll just say personally, if we were to go to a route which included private sector stuff on it, I would only want to do that if the private sector was paying for the upkeep of the map. And if not, then I'd say, then I really don't want to personally undertake it. Go ahead.
I just want to, just because this is a discussion that we had at the subcommittee meeting, and so I just wanted to bring up the thought process around that, if that's just from and why we discussed sort of the idea of an interactive map, because we talked about both those options, and I think the thought was we're where we are, and wouldn't you want to have, I mean, at least my view is something more dynamic, where you would have maybe get some private sector funding to upkeep it, to maybe restaurants would want to offer discounts on certain things or ads, or we can do things and have a more interactive thing to show off kind of what things were in a city versus just a static map. And we looked at the price difference, and it was about, I think, $2,000 more to do a interactive map than a static map. And so that was kind of the thought that let's bring this up to the council to have some discussions about, would that be more interesting to have a couple of those around to sort of as a better approach.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. That's it for now for my questions. Laura, I see you have some.
Yeah, so just kind of going back to a couple of the goals that were outlined for the project, and around getting drivers parked near destinations and other cars to ease congestion and support circulation between destinations for all users. How does this plan and these recommendations compares to some of the other cities that you've seen where you've actually adopted a wayfinding system? What were the results in those cases against those types of objectives, and how does this plan compare in your estimations? Because, for example, traffic circulation and congestion are big issues for us, so I'm just trying to get a feel for how close you think we were hitting the mark and meeting those objectives, if you can talk to that.
Well, I think that, you know, by highlighting the parking within the city and comparing this to other cities that we've worked with as well, I mean, I don't have hard numbers for that, but not only does it help improve the city image, but it does, they have found that, you know, parking, there's always a perception that there is no parking in many of the cities that we work with. So we found that by really highlighting these parking signs and having it tie in with the city wayfinding, that people are taking advantage of those more. Or, you know, there's some cities we've worked with where there's city lots that are a little bit hidden out of the way. And so these wayfinding signs also help to direct to those signs and to those parking areas.
Adam.
I guess I want to just clarify kind of what the goal is for today in terms of what we're trying to approve. I mean, it's the look and the feel. It's and my understanding is we can sort of pull out certain pieces. So, for example, I'm not sure I love all the locations that we've talked about, the sign location plan itself, but I'm maybe comfortable with the design, the look and feel, the color scheme we're doing. So that may be one direction to move forward on that, but may want to revisit the idea of where we do this, how we do certain the signs, locations, and directions. So I just want to get clarification that there's an opportunity to kind of pick and choose a few things. There's no initial fiscal impact on this until we decide sort of next steps, where we'd want to place it, how many signs, and things like that.
That's correct. Really, the intent of tonight is to get direction on whether people are supportive of the designs, want to move forward with those, and if they are, we can make changes later on to where signs are located and whether we want more signs somewhere or fewer of a certain type of sign.
Okay. Well, now I have two additional questions. So I guess I misunderstood the discussion, Adam, you had with Ron earlier. So we are not tonight approving the additional expenditure of an additional $240,000 out of the general fund? That's correct. Okay, we are not. So it's just at some point in the future, we anticipate, depending upon exactly the signs and how many of them we get and whatnot, that's probably order of magnitude what it would cost when it comes back for approval.
That's right. Really, yeah, what we're looking for now is this will allow us to then go out and collect quotations so we get an exact price for that.
Okay. My other question, you've obviously done a lot of vetting with this. I guess what I'd like to drill down on a little bit is at least some of these signs, what I think of as the branding signs, like the ones, you know, for example, you did those nice renderings of what it might look like if we replaced or made some substantial modifications to the main sign at San Carlos Avenue and El Camino. One of the things I've learned being on this side of the dais is that anytime you do something like that, there's always some portion of the community that goes just insanely angry about what you've done. Insane is the wrong word. I mean, they just honestly feel very upset about the change. So what vetting have you done to try and assess whether or not there's some degree of at least acceptance of this, or are we just going to create a firestorm by, not the wayfinding stuff, but we're just going to create a firestorm by introducing some of the branding elements?
Yeah, so we did hold a public meeting open to everyone at the youth center. I think that was last year. And generally the feedback we received was people were positive. They liked the changes. They liked the designs. I think there were a couple of people that were concerned with changing anything on that main gateway sign, since it's kind of a very prominent feature, but more people were supportive of it at that time.
How did we advertise that meeting, and roughly, do you recall roughly how many people showed up?
I was not here at that time. Let Allie answer.
I believe it was advertised on Facebook, and there might have been another post on the city website itself. We did have a low turnout. I think there were members from the steering committee. I think there are maybe 5 citizens that showed up to that meeting.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay.
I'm not surprised to hear that. Related to the comment I made earlier is we're all familiar with the fact that even though we agendize these discussions and we do lots of outreach and stuff, in all fairness, most times, most people do not pay attention to what we're doing until after it happens. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for the presentations. That's all the questions I had. Did anybody else have questions? If not, I do not have any speaker cards on this item. Is there anybody in the public that would like to comment on this? Okay, seeing none. I will move forward to discussion, introduction of motion, whichever the dais prefers. Oh, and by the way, as I forgot to say tonight, this is a general have at it. So whoever, you don't have to go through me on this, just go.
So I guess, and I just, as we're kind of just talking about kind of feedback on the different pieces, if we were going to make some changes in terms of the gateway signs and other pieces, my preference is to stay with the branding and color palette that's sort of been approved versus, I guess, the more brown, lighter stuff. I think it just having that consistency gives us the ability to brand something as San Carlos, because that's sort of our coloring. I did like, Chair Olbert, your idea about having some signs with some of the more iconic or pieces that sort of are San Carlos-like. I think that sort of adds something to the branding for it, and adds something to the signs themselves.
I think my only comment is, I remember that we sort of went through this process when I was on EDAC before I ran for council, and it's nice to see this sort of evolve. But to your comment earlier, Mark, just my only preference in this process is that whatever the signs that are put up that we have refer only to city items, city structures, the museum, the parking lots, that sort of thing. I think wayfinding for particular businesses is something that ought to be dealt with separately, and I think, as you said, have the businesses pay for that. But I would, because businesses come and go, I certainly wouldn't want to start putting business names on these signs. These really are just, where are the parks? Where are the parking lots? Where's the museum? Where's the airport? And I think that's...
if we start augmenting our bike lanes and stuff, where bike routes, where those
bike
are.
Bike routes,
yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, that's really my only comment.
Other comments?
I take Ron's point. I agree with that. And if we're weighing in on option A or option B, I prefer option A. Throwing that out there.
And just for my own, option A versus B is mostly the colors, is that correct? Or is also some of the background elements of some of the signage?
There's
okay, I see it on the screen in front of me.
Except for second from the left. So you can see the existing structure is closer to the one shown in option B, And then in option A, what we're suggesting are taking some of the elements from that gateway at San Carlos Avenue and attaching it to that structure. So it would be retrofitted to feel more like the rest of the gateway signs.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, so just kind of circling back to the budget issue that was brought up earlier, I think from my perspective, I think the priority is really around the wayfinding and helping people get around downtown and find parking and that type of thing. So at a certain point in the project, if we have to prioritize, I think it'd be important for us to kind of go through this. Some of the elements seem like they're nice to have, and I'm not so sure they're adding a ton of value. For example, like the City of Good Living, and I think that was proposed as like a metal cutout or something like that as a feature. But I think I would prefer that we, when we get to the budget part, I think we need to really prioritize and be clear about what we're spending money on and why. And I would just favor the wayfinding for parking and that type of thing over some of these other elements.
Yeah, I agree with that. In fact, it kind of, in my mind, resonates a little bit against this issue of the concern I raised about if we go out and change some of the major signage, the branding signage in San Carlos, I think we will hear back from people about it. And I don't object to things evolve. I don't at all object to changing things. I actually think the proposed signage of a branding nature looks very, very nice. But I almost feel like we ought to do it as a two-step thing and sort of acquaint people with do the wayfinding first and do more outreach to kind of acquaint people with some of the things we may be thinking about doing down the road, just to give the community a chance to weigh in on it, sort of kick it around a little bit and see how they feel about it. I just frankly don't want to surprise the community in some big fashion, because people don't generally react well to surprise unless there's a particularly important reason why you need to do that. And I think the wayfinding, there is a good reason to do that. The branding, there are good reasons to do that, but they're not as potent as the wayfinding side.
So I just want to clarify one thing, one question, one comment, I guess maybe two comments. So I think to Ron's point and Mark, your point on the businesses sort of being there, I don't think the intention, and I think the only place would be in that one kiosk if we wanted to consider. I think the rest of the signs, I wouldn't want to have pointing to businesses. I think it was just sort of that one piece to consider on that end. So I don't have a strong opinion on it. So I will that. And I do think when Laura mentioned the sort of having the City of Good Living signs and other stuff, I think that's sort of a budget thing, because I'd rather see us go to more parks with the wayfinding and spend so that, let's say at Big Canyon, there's a wayfinding, or to North Crestview, there's a wayfinding, versus signs that just say City of Good Living. I think they should be more purposeful from that end.
Yeah, and actually to that extent, maybe even since we're talking about wayfinding, there actually is signage at each of the parks now, which was upgraded in the last few years. But to my knowledge, I don't think there's any signage that sort of says how to get to Big Canyon. I mean, you obviously can look it up online and do it, but that type of wayfinding to me would be valuable. I'd like to see us do that. All right, let me take a shot at sort of summarizing this. I think what I'm hearing is there is general support for the idea of going forward with the next phase, probably focused at least, maybe the next phase, it doesn't need to be focused on just the wayfinding, but sort of the direction I'm sort of sensing is there's more support for doing something about wayfinding than there is for some of the branding stuff. And then the color scheme, so far I think the only thing that people have expressed an interest in is the option A thing when it comes to the branding stuff. Is that a reasonable expression of what the sense is? Does anybody want to disagree with that? Or
I said I prefer option B because it sticks with the branding colors.
Oh, you're right, you did. Sorry, thank you. Well, maybe we'll have a cage match between you and Sarah, and the two of you can decide what it is. No, I'm just teasing. Well, I suppose that to the extent that we are focusing in terms of implementation initially on the wayfinding stuff, further work can be done on from a design point of view on both options. I imagine that, because that's not, you're not actually building anything at that point. Does that make sense to staff? Jeff, am I giving direction to staff? Am I summarizing something that actually would be useful to staff, or am I not on target?
No, I think you are summarizing it in a way that's useful, although it still would be useful to sort of determine which color palette the council liked better.
All right, well, since then we need to look to the people who didn't weigh in. Laura and Ron, which color palette do you like? And feel free to suggest a third one if you like that better.
After you, Laura.
Option A.
Complicate things. I'm going to go with option B just because it sticks out more. But I notice it more. So.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. You now make me the tiebreaker. Well, no, you know, in all honesty, I do not have a strong opinion one way or another. I personally prefer option B a little bit because I just like that particular color scheme a little bit more, which technically means that there's a slight majority for option B. But one of the concepts I introduced years ago when I was on the school board is there's a difference between a yes and no, a heck yes and a heck no. So does anybody on the option A side really have a significant problem if we went with option B?
Heck no.
I thought you were, okay, fine. Then I think, Jeff, have we defined stuff for staff adequately?
I believe we have.
And that means, however, we still need to, we've had all of our discussion and now we need to actually have a motion, correct? So gentlemen and ladies, I will entertain a motion. If somebody would care to make it, and if they don't, then all of our discussion has been for naught.
I move to adopt Resolution 2019-13. A resolution of the City Council of City of St. Carlos approving the citywide wayfinding study and authorizing staff to proceed with engaging a qualified professional services firm to complete the necessary design and engineering.
Is there a second?
Second.
There's a motion and a second. Jeff, I presume all of the notes basically that we just described will be incorporated in what staff does?
That's correct.
All right. Any discussion? Seeing none or hearing none, Crystal, would you please call the roll?
Councilmember McDowell?
Yes.
Councilmember Rack?
Yes.
Councilmember Collins?
Yes.
Councilmember Olbert?
Yes.
And Councilmember Palmer Lohan?
Yes.
All right. That completes item 9A. Item 9, we'll move on to item 9B, consideration of adopting.
Can we take a 2-minute break?
You know what? We will do better than that. We will take a 5-minute break. the formation of a wildfire safety committee. Good evening, Chief Pucci.
Good evening, Chair O'Rourke and council members. Wildfire safety has obviously been a hot topic in San Carlos for the last period of time, and the fire department's taken many actions to start mitigating those threats. And one of the concepts that came up was forming a committee on wildfire safety as a conduit of information sharing with the fire department, a resource for research and that kind of thing. So this is my proposal on how I think that could actually work and what we would do to keep it functional and effective and give us the information that we need. I think the formation of the committee ideally be kept to a fairly small group of 3 to 5 members for efficiency's sake, and ideally, obviously, they would have to be San Carlos residents. We want them to have some skin in the game and be residents of our community. And then ideally also from different parts of the city. The wildfire threat is obviously vastly different in the industrial area versus the wildfire interface, so different representation from different portions of the city would be a very positive thing. And for how would these community members join this committee? What we would do is we'd have the community members contact the city clerk. They can gather their list of names. And then really the selection and interview process would belong to the city council. You'd be able to meet with the individuals, ask what questions you wanted to ask them, and decide who would be on the committee. And initial proposals for a 1-year commitment, and the city council would have that committee continue or not, depending on if there's more work to be done after year 1. The goals of the committee, it's really what it boils down to is the wildfire threat to the city. So currently that would include input on the fuels management program, evacuation policies and plans, and then the various fire department, fire detection technologies that are out there, and get that input from and the expertise of the committee. And really, that's it for my report tonight. I just wanted to get input from the council on if you thought that would be effective and meets your goals.
Thank you, Chief Pucci, and there's no problem with presentations being short. So, one of my first managers gave me advice many years ago, which I always try to remember and often don't, which is I would have written you a shorter memo, but I didn't have time. So, questions? Laura.
So, thank you. Thank you for the short report. So you and I've had a few conversations about this going back to the summer about wildfire mitigation and that type of thing. And more recently, we had the opportunity to be at the farmers market booth on a rainy Sunday.
Very low fire threat day.
Yeah. What you shared with me at the time I thought was interesting in that, and you've shared this multiple times, is that there is kind of a multiple point strategy around mitigating fire risk. And I think it sounds to me like a component of that is around education across the community. And one thing that struck me in particular this past weekend is you talked about, every family can have their own fire safety evacuation plan. That doesn't mitigate the need for a wider city plan, right, that has to be well coordinated in the event of a big disaster. But to what extent, I guess, would this committee, in your mind, serve kind of the broader strategy that is already in place? What I'm trying to reconcile is if there's kind of common things that the fire department and CAL FIRE are working on, what role specifically would this committee play when it seems like what we're trying to do is get the word out to multiple people, and then there may be some additional strategies we need to consider? So I'm just confused about how this plays into all that.
I think that the committee could, if there's people of the community that have a particular interest, can certainly gather information. Many of them would possibly have some expertise that might be some outside of the box thinking that is not on our minds at this point. And I also think it serves as a information channel between the fire department and the community. Really, there is no one solution to this problem. It has to be multi-pronged. It has to be individual education, mitigation, planning, comprehensive.
Ron.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I realize that we said this would be a 1-year appointment. In reality, how long do you think the whole process would take?
I think there would be an initial ramp up and meeting with the committee members to really define what information we want to gather and get their input initially. And I don't think once we get the information and that input that we need and roll out a plan, that it would necessarily be that long. 1 year seemed like a natural benchmark to say, well, at that point we can revisit and see if there's more that needs to be done. I do think that probably within that year, or maybe even less than that, we'd be able to gather the information that we needed.
Okay. Where do you see us in relation to other communities in our wildfire planning?
I think we're doing pretty well. There are certainly agencies out there that are cutting edge. We are working with several agencies within the county, and Moraga Orinda comes to mind. They are very deep into the technology aspect and are looking at some very interesting technology that is automated, that can potentially tie into the alert and warning system automatically without having that human send a message out to people. So we're looking very closely at that. The community interest in this subject is really very common throughout the county, and we're meeting frequently with our counterparts in other agencies, trying not to duplicate work.
Right.
Working with CAL FIRE recently, and they came up with a great idea on how they can fund one portion of a particular project this week for the entire county. So really, we're all putting our heads together. We have a lot of expertise in the room, especially with CAL FIRE helping us with that too. It's a good working relationship in the county.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but I was just thinking there are a lot of tools out there. There's a lot of technology, early warning systems, cameras, other mitigation options. If we were to, let's say this committee came up with a list of recommendations and they involved, the latest technology. I'll just give it that broad category. You want to give me a wild guess as to what you think we as a city might want to budget for that? I know maybe that's not even a fair question. I'm just trying to get a general sense of, where the state of where technology is today and how much you think that could impact a city like ours, on our budget.
It's really hard to give a number right now because I'm just learning about what some of the things cost between sensors and cameras. It really depends on what system we design. You can create a incredibly comprehensive system that would cost $1 million. Each price tag is going to have to come back with a cost-benefit analysis that is acceptable to the council. I really wouldn't have a dollar amount that I can give you right now. Some of the technology, and also how much roadway that we cover with, right. It really depends on the scope of the work.
That's all right. I just wanted to ask the question, and not knowing is acceptable. So, yeah. All right. That's it for the moment. Adam?
Thanks, and thanks, Chief Pucci. I guess kind of a couple quick questions, and one is, so I think you mentioned sort of different ways to sort of approach this, a lot of different ideas, so I guess I would throw it from the perspective of, are there other ways that we could manage this outside of a committee? Like, could we, is there a way to let's do a couple public hearing, sort of town meetings around it, gather feedback, or have some more educational seminars? So I'd love to get your thoughts on sort of what you think might be the effective way, most effective way to look at this, and also understanding that there's some urgency around this too. So I wouldn't want to do something that's going to take years to put together. I know you mentioned probably 9 months or a year or whatever type of thing, but I want to sort of how can we be sort of most efficient and effective as well?
Well, I think community meetings are certainly a possibility. We're already planning on doing that as well. And I think the other half of the equation too is what the feedback that we get from this community meeting and the fire department putting out to the community exactly what we're doing. I think we need to do a little bit more of that just to show the community the comprehensive approach that we're taking to wildfire threat. But community meetings would be a great tool.
Okay. And this may not be just a question in general, just I think looking at the hillside, and so we're doing work on the sort of city-owned areas, and we've just approved that a couple of weeks ago for some funding for some of the parks and other areas. But do we, and this may be a better question for Greg, but are there any way to sort of mandate any kind of defensible space on some of the hillside? What ability would we have maybe from a city standpoint to do anything around that, if anything?
I can get some numbers together, and you can stop me if I'm going off track. So one of the things that we do is the wildland urban interface inspections. We do that in the spring of every year. in the high wildfire threat area, we'll go through and look at different properties. Last year, we were able to identify 379 violations of the fire code when it comes to vegetation management around private property. And we also responded to 72 complaints from the community about of somebody else's specific property that they noticed. I don't have a complete number of the number of residences. We were trying to get that out of GIS today, but that was out of the entire area of the wildland-urban interface. Those are the numbers of violations that we do. So we go out there and we can issue a notice saying, hey, here's a problem with your residents, and look for voluntary compliance. Usually give them 2 weeks to do that. It could be weed abatement or something like that, or whatever the violation is. And it can progress to a point where if we're just absolutely not getting compliance at all, we can go through the code enforcement avenue where there's actually financial penalties for not complying.
Okay, thank you.
May I follow up on that just a little bit, because I was curious about something. And this, I think, probably is a great question. What are the boundaries of our statutory authority to set things like clearance zones around property? I mean, is that a state thing, or is it state preemption?
In that area, we've adopted by reference the fire code, and so all the provisions that the chief's talking about are located in that. It's something the city can enforce. We might be able to, enhance from the fire code at the time we adopt the fire code. That's one opportunity to do it. We make a finding of unique circumstances in the community. We might be able to make those findings to vary from the main code. And then it's possible that outside the area of fire code, we might be able to do some other things, but I'd be glad to look at that to see what other communities might be doing. But normally we've relied on the fire code in San Carlos.
It's probably a little early to do that research, but I just mostly wanted to hear that unlike a straight out preemption, as we've discovered in some other areas recently, we do have some flexibility, it sounds like, done the right way. Chief, thank you very much. Good presentation. Most of my questions already got answered. The one that I have left, I got an email which I just realized, A, I had not yet replied to, and B, I think the person probably expected me to forward it to the entire council, so I don't know if they're familiar with it or not. But it's from an individual who used to live in San Carlos and now lives in one of the unincorporated county areas that's sort of inside of San Carlos, Devonshire Canyon area. I'd be interested in your thoughts on and knowledge of, like, what is the county doing? Because that's really their bailiwick, right? The unincorporated county areas are theirs. But clearly, fire knows no boundaries, right? So whatever we do and what we'd like them to do sort of all falls in the same section. So do you coordinate these kind of efforts? Do you coordinate with the county on that? Are they doing anything in this regard?
We do. We work with Chief Cox from CAL FIRE and meet regularly. As far as the specific actions, I mean, they're enforcing the fire code in similar manners that we are, and dealing with the same problems that we're experiencing too. As far as specific programs, I could gather more information if you were really curious exactly what CAL FIRE is doing in first, I should say San Mateo County Fire by contract with CAL FIRE.
But and you may just not know this, but for example, to your knowledge, the county is not, or CAL FIRE with the county is not currently doing something similar to what we're contemplating doing, affecting the areas that, like Devonshire Canyon, that are unincorporated, that happen to be within the boundaries of San Carlos.
They do have a vegetation management program in San Mateo County. They actually do live burns in certain parts of the county, certain times of year. They will also do urban interface inspections as well. I know the basics are there, but they've had a vegetation management program for quite some time.
Okay.
As well as having the hand crews within their own agency to actually do the work too. That's handy.
All right, fair enough. Laura.
So question, it sounds like your thoughts are that there's probably multiple ways that we can address this. Some of the other committees, so for example, SHAC was made up of 7 people. I believe the Community Foundation Committee is made up of, I don't know, 10, 15 perhaps?
It's actually more than that.
Much larger group. So what's driving the recommendation that this just be 3 to 5 members? Just given, I guess what I'm thinking about is that if you're recommending that the group focus on fuels management program, evacuation policies and plans, and fire detection technology, that covers kind of a broad scope of things, and that seems like a fairly small group. So I'm just wondering kind of what the logic is for the size.
In my mind, with committees, typically the larger they get, the longer the process will be. So I think that this is a subject that we need to be fairly able to react quickly to recommendations and new technologies that come out, to adopt them and get them in place. We've been really pushing hard on wildfire preparedness and vegetation management for several years now. And a lot of these things just take a lot of time, especially when FEMA's involved. And I think with a committee, we can certainly listen to the recommendations of council. I think my impression would be that the bigger the committee, probably the little slower it would be.
Sarah?
Following up on Laura's questions, I agree. I think 3 is very small. If the purpose of the committee is to be very representative and pull people from different parts of the city, I don't know how 3 people would, even represent different neighborhoods. Also, how do quorum rules pertain to that? Because 3 people, if one person's absent, then you can't meet. Are they subject to the same, Brown Act stuff that EDAC is, or any other commission?
Yeah, we do have one committee that only has 3, the RDRC committee, and it can act with 2.
Okay. And then I just wanted to kind of pick your brain a little bit about the specific mission of the commission, if it's listening to presentations and kind of giving a thumbs up or thumbs down, or how much input would they have into these 3 areas that are mentioned to kind of drive the process? Because I want to make sure that we're being very conscientious that whoever serves on this committee feels like they have input. And I take Adam's point too about the town halls. I think that it's really important to reach out to the broader community and get feedback on all 3 of these issues. And I'm struggling a little bit with how representative 3 people would be.
Yeah, I think that we can change that number. The process, I just think it's important that we share and provide them input, and ultimately we're going to be putting our heads together with the committee, and then they would report to the council, and the council would be able to give direction to the fire department of, this is important to us, look into it further, or this is the system that we think will work best in the city, that kind of thing. So they'd be coming to you for you to ultimately make those decisions.
Adam?
I was on already. 2 quick questions. One, is there a sense for we think the cost would be to sort of run this committee for 9 months or a year? Any thoughts around that? Or maybe from a cost from time standpoint, let's look at it that way.
I think it would be minimal. I think it would be the community members volunteering to be on this committee and us meeting with them at different hours of the day that would make sure that we can actually keep the meetings going and that kind of thing. So I think the fiscal impact would be pretty minimal.
And then just to follow up on that, are there other cities that are taking this approach versus sort of a community meeting approach, or just sort of working directly with fire departments and trying to get some feedback? And what have you seen in some other places in the county?
I'm not aware of any other committee in the county. I do know that, the fire department on a wide variety of subjects will hold community meetings. We tend to host those in the fire stations on a variety of subjects, whether it's disaster preparedness or anything like that. And we like to get the community into the fire station and meet one-on-one or with the crews there. So that's common for us.
And since you've had some of these, what's sort of your sense on the outreach and the attendance for these sort of things?
It can vary. Sometimes we can be very well prepared and get a very small group, and other times it depends on what we tend to do is try to use neighborhood associations and try to break the city up by those groups, figuring that they're probably already meeting through, whether it's a neighborhood watch or CERT or something like that. So we try to take those existing organizational structures and communicate to the group and announce the meetings through those groups and get better attendance that way.
Okay, thanks.
Laura?
Thank you. So I'm kind of struggling with this concept because I agree that we need to act quickly. I know the community's concerned. The size of fires is not getting any smaller. I've lived in California most of my life. And it strikes me that I feel like it's like there's two pieces to this. One is around the need to educate the community, to empower them. I think those were some words that you shared with me this past weekend. Because there's basic things that can be done, blocking and tackling, that we know to be true, right? But then there's some other elements to this that require subject matter expertise. And I'm just wondering how this is going to be different than, so for example, we have a wayfinding committee, we went out and hired a design expert, right, for wayfinding. And it strikes me that a lot of these things that you're looking at are very technical in nature. So why wouldn't we do the same thing here? Go out and hire a subject matter expert or work with some of these other agencies to kind of come back to us with recommendations, and then to Adam's point, do more community-based forums to, collect that input from a broader audience. I think, Sarah, you mentioned that also, across the community, because I don't know that this is just a 3 or 5 person thing. It feels to me like we need some subject matter experts, and we need to empower the community and educate the community through, kind of a different form. So I'm just kind of not understanding why we're headed down this particular route. I don't know who that, maybe Jeff, that looks like you.
I can weigh in a little bit. This is in response to an item that came up at the mini retreat where the suggestion was made that we prepare an item like this for your consideration as opposed to an item that came from staff. I think committees are very powerful tools, and we do a lot of committee work here in San Carlos over the years, and I'm sure we'll continue to employ that strategy. Committees can be a slower process. I think we spent, what was it, Al's left the room, close to 1.5 years or so on the House Size Committee that just wrapped up their work. And they can be good tools when you're looking at vetting a lot of different options, when you have a sort of a huge menu of possibilities. Other ways are to engage the whole community through larger scale meetings and public information campaigns and those kinds of things, which we've also done on many different occasions too. So there's really no, there's one is not better than the other. It's simply a matter of sort of how the council feels, what fits what you're trying to accomplish here. We know that you want to move quickly. That was very clear at the conversation you had during the mini retreat, that this is an item that has the council's attention, and that there's a lot of urgency behind this, and that you want to, whatever process we go through here, you want to see that turn into options for the council to consider, so that you can make those improvements to the community before the next fire season really gets rolling.
And to answer, I'm sorry, I wanted to answer the second part of the question too. And as far as subject matter experts, I think there's a great deal of knowledge already within the county to best practices within the fire service for what works, because we have people that have worked all over the state over the years that have seen a lot of different fire behavior. I do see me coming back at some point to you, talking to you about having to bring on a certain type of expert depending on what technology is being looked at, and it'll probably be looked at by multiple jurisdictions. To be able to give you better information on the new technology, because it's changing so fast and updating so fast, that I do see that coming up.
I'd like to thank you, Chief Bucci. I'd like to suggest this is a good discussion and good questions being asked, but we're actually sort of transitioning into the discussion phase, which is fine because we need to get there before we take action of whatever we're going to do. But I was going to suggest that unless we have some specific questions to ask staff at this point, it might be appropriate to move to public comment, because we do have an individual who would like to address the council on this. And then if there are additional questions that sparks, we'll get them answered. And if not, we'll move on to discussion. So is that reasonable? Okay. So I have one speaker card, and if anybody else wishes to address the council on this item, please fill out a card and give it to Crystal. And that's from Ken Castle, who already knew that because he was walking up towards the front. Good evening again, Ken. Since, if my colleagues don't mind, since Ken has spent so much time and effort personally on this particular subject, I'd like us to be give him a little bit more time in public comment, and say if you can keep it to less than 4 minutes rather than 2, we'd appreciate it.
I can answer all of your questions. I've spent 5 months on this. This county has very little experience with citizen-based groups and fire protection issues. It's just getting going. That's why Belmont just voted for a group and its campaign just about a month ago. But you have to look across the bay. You have to look up into the North Bay to see what's going on. There are groups that have been around for 25 years in the East Bay. And it's not just sitting idly around talking about, new technologies and what we might do. They are getting things done, specific actions, such as getting grants from local agencies. For example, in the East Bay, the group I always point to, and I had it in the presentation that I sent to all of you, is Fire Safe Diablo Council. Now, some of these groups are more or less first responders and other entities, but they also involve a lot of residents and homeowners, and they work closely in a manner to develop projects such as fuel mitigation issues, such as getting specific grants so that rather than just point to the residents, say it's your job to take care of your property, they go out and get a grant from East Bay Municipal Utility District or East Bay Regional Parks District, where there's 50-50 sharing in the cost of doing fuel mitigation around specific properties. This is community by community. So they've been around for 25 years. They just did an evacuation drill in the town of Moraga in middle of December. The way I look at things here, and I've been thinking about this a great deal, this is a regional matter. This is not just a city of San Carlos matter. It's not just the property we own. It's the property that surrounds us that we have no jurisdiction over, that we need to be talking to people like Mid-Peninsula Open Space Preserve, which has all that land on the west side of Crestview, which is the Pulgas Ridge Preserve. They own 60,000 acres in the peninsula. We have the San Francisco Water Department. In Devonshire is a mix of jurisdictions, as Mayor Olbert has pointed out, and it tends not to get a unified program going because we've got pieces there that are San Carlos, pieces that are Belmont, pieces that are the county. And so it's easy to go clear a park that we own entirely, but it's not easy to get into a mixed jurisdictional area. We need to, with this group, form a collaborative, in my view, association with the city of Belmont, because they have land that adjoins us. They have land that's involved in Devonshire. We need to look at evacuation routes. We need to have scenarios and hypothetical situations. People in the hillside areas are aware that some of these evacuation routes that we have existing could get very crowded very quickly, and we need to look at some alternatives. We need to look at developing safe zones in places where people can't evacuate. So all of you and all of us are flatlanders, but if you go up into the hillside and you drive up to the top of Devonshire Canyon, up along Winding Way and Wyndham, it would be very obvious that should a big fire break out anywhere around the top of that area, people are not going to be able to evacuate, and fire engines are not going to be able to get to the top. So what do? Do we create a safe zone? What do we do about that? So I've been attending meetings of the Fire Safe San Mateo Council for the last several months, getting a real good bird's eye view of the issues and the complexities of this, what CAL FIRE is doing, issues that we may need to face as a city, which is incorporating a wildfire safety plan into our general plan when we have a significant update to the general plan, or perhaps new subdivisions such as the ones we're looking at Black Mountain. So there may be issues here that Transportation and Circulation Commission could take on, such as roadways, rules regulating parking along narrow roads, alternative escape routes.
Ken, I'm going to ask you to move to wrapping up, please.
Okay. But I'm trying to respond to all of your questions, so please indulge me. I'm just about done. So I think this committee, I also agree it should be larger than 3 to 5. I think it should be 7 to 9. We have people in the hills who are retired firefighters. We have technology, software, hardware experts, all kinds of folks, a number of people that belong to condominium homeowners associations. I could name 7 people almost off the top of my head.
Ken, I really need you to move to wrap up, please.
Okay. So I would encourage you to move forward with this, and the committee can map out some strategies and come back to you where I think it'll be evident the directions you might want to move.
Thank you very much. All right. Anybody else wish to address the council on this item? Seeing none, we'll move to discussion. if I may do something a little bit, not out of the ordinary, but a little different than what I've done heretofore, I actually had a thought that was sparked by a number of the questions and discussions and Ken's comments and whatnot that I wanted to bounce off the council. I also, after I describe it, I would like to have Greg opine as to whether or not what I'm thinking of is consistent with how we've agendized this item, since, as you know, I have a reputation for sometimes coming up with ideas that we haven't agendized so that we can't discuss them. So the idea basically sort of started from the idea, a couple of points. One is, I think we're all agreed this is a really urgent issue. And it's not only an urgent issue for us here. Ken, I think, did an excellent job of describing how significant it is. We've all heard from a lot of people in town. What happened in Paradise, what's been happening in California for the last several years, has really got people very focused on this. That's sort of one starting point. The other point is something, it's an enlargement of something Jeff mentioned. San Carlos has a history of relying on its residents to actually help guide the policy setting process or inform the policy setting process that the council then enacts and sort of fine tunes and hires experts to fill in the blanks on. And frankly, I mean, that's not a negative reflection on the council. It's actually a positive reflection on our community. We have a community of a lot of very committed, very smart people who have spent a lot of time thinking about all sorts of different issues. And then the third element of this sort of grew out of something I heard Dave and Laura talking about in some of the Q&A. There's a very significant education component to this. Not only in terms of educating us in terms of formulating policy and direction, but educating the community about some of the details and the alternatives that the fire people are using and some of the work that Ken has done. So kind of riffing off of something that Adam touched on, I almost feel now like, even though we've agendized this as setting up a wildfire safety committee, I almost feel like what I'd like to see us do, at least to start with, is some pretty intensive community outreach meetings that we would direct staff to advertise thoroughly in the community, to bring people in, give them an opportunity to share their thoughts, concerns, ideas, have our fire department and fire experts share practices and what's going on in other communities, and use it kind of as a crowdsourcing concept to come up with ideas that could be brought back to the council for us to filter through the requisite commissions or for us to just take up directly. Because I personally think that that would be a faster process than putting a committee together and sort of saying, please come back to us in 9 months with some recommendations. I think we could, it's so much a top of mind thing for people, we could get moving on it. So Greg, before discussion breaks out on this, is that if we were to do something like that, is it consistent enough with the agendized item that we could go that way?
Well, I think my gut reaction is that what you're really proposing is to direct staff to do community outreach rather than setting up a committee. So I think you could do that from just from a general direction standpoint, but we can't really develop the details or discuss that very thoroughly. You just say you'd like staff to do some community outreach, and that would be the limit of what you could do tonight.
I see. So in other words, we would not, what we'd be doing is not acting on the particular thing here, but instead giving different direction to take a different tact, and maybe staff has to come back with a plan for how they're going to do this. I don't know. But
well, it may not have to come back for a plan, because I think staff's probably capable of initiating that process. If the council wanted to, I think if we wanted to get into the details, I really just feel like we probably would need to agendize that at some point. I mean, setting up a subcommittee of the council or something, I think it's just going to require further discussion and votes on who to be on it and everything like that, if that's something you were thinking of doing.
No. I literally meant doing the community outreach idea that Adam had sort of touched on and whatnot. Jeff, it looks like you wanted to say something.
I was just going to say, if that's the direction that the council wants to go, I wouldn't anticipate needing to come back for additional direction or resources from the council to be able to hold a series of meetings.
And to advertise them effectively.
And to advertise them. We have sufficient funds within our existing budget to do that sort of thing. So we could, if that's where you go tonight, we could put a newsletter item in the council newsletter describing time frame and elements and those kinds of things as we get them organized.
What I propose is, I apologize, a little bit more long-winded than I thought it was going to be. Maybe at this point, really the relevant thing is there anybody else on the council who thinks we ought to consider doing something like that? I'm certainly open to discussing the details of exactly what kind of committee, if we go that route instead, we want to set up. But I just wanted to toss that idea out there because just listening to all the stuff going on, I personally think it might be a more community-involved, broadly based education, crowdsourcing, idea generation, and more rapid turnaround kind of process. But what do the rest of you guys think?
I like that idea because I think it's, I think this is an issue that's top of mind for people. I think we need to be as efficient as possible, and I think this is a good way to get there, especially given the need for education around this issue.
Yeah, I like the idea of, given the fact that there are a number of subject matter experts, that we're currently, it sounds like currently working with to pull those individuals into the meeting. I also like the idea of doing, inviting some of our neighboring communities to join us, because I think the idea that, we have to work together, right, across the region to come up with some solutions. But I'm just compelled to try to figure out what we can do more quickly, I guess. And the word committee is just making me a little concerned that that's not going to be as fast as we need it to be.
Right. May I, before somebody chimes in, Jeff, could you, and I know I just sprung this idea on you, but if we were to do an in-depth kind of community outreach, education, idea generation thing, as I was describing, how long do you think it would take before that was finished and staff would be able to report back to the council, here's what we've learned, here's suggestions, here's things to look at, whatever?
Just a matter of probably a few months.
Okay.
I would think 2.5, 3 months would be adequate time to design it, advertise it. We'd want to do that well in advance, probably pick a couple of dates. This would certainly be something where we would want to have a weekend meeting available for the community. So we try to avoid 3-day weekends when we're targeting those kinds of weekends for meetings, and then be able to get back to you, very quickly after that. I would suggest we do 2 of these, and then if it's, 2 full houses and it seems like, we're turning people away kind of thing, then keep going until we feel like we've saturated the community. I'd also like to be able to video record is something I like to do with these types of meetings so that we can rebroadcast them so the meetings themselves become an educational tool and resource for the community, for those folks who couldn't make any of the dates or for whatever reason we weren't able to penetrate their consciousness in terms of the advertising of the event, that kind of thing. So, but pretty quick, and keep in mind it's probably a 2.5 month process just to be able to appoint a commission or a committee to get started in terms of, there's usually about a 4-week application period after we've advertised it and those kinds of things. So it'd certainly be pretty quick.
Okay, I apologize for that. I just wanted to get, the comment you made about speed made me think I wanted to ask Jeff for input on that. I see lights flashing, but this is open forum, so just go.
Just go. Chief Pucci, do you feel like if we did 2 of these community outreach events that you would get guidance needed to move forward with certain aspects of what you had listed as things to tackle by the committee?
I think so. And the other thing too is if we meet somebody in one of these meetings that has a particular expertise, it doesn't mean we stop talking to them after the meeting's done. We can still maintain open lines of communication with whoever wants to maintain or be involved.
Right. That's a good segue into my second question, is if after these 2 community meetings we decide, well, a commission might really be helpful now that all of these ideas have arisen and we've met a dozen really great people in our community who are super involved in this issue, we could move down that path later, correct? Okay.
Well, since I'm the person that brought up the idea of a committee, I still like it. I still think it's something that we should pursue. I don't necessarily have an objection to a community forum, but I think that at the end of that, I think to Sarah's point, we ought to make a decision that as to whether or not we need to move forward with a committee. And if we do move forward with the committee, I think it ought to be a larger committee, 7 to 9 people, because you want to get a lot of viewpoints in there. And it's possible that a community forum would sort of inform the direction of a committee. So I don't want to abandon the idea altogether. I think it has a lot of merit.
All right. Well, I guess let me see if I can try this out. Apropos of what Greg described a few minutes ago, I think what I'm hearing is general support on the dais. Ron, you may be different about this, but general support on the dais for directing staff to go off and do this kind of in-depth community outreach, information gathering, idea generation, education thing, to be followed up by a report back to council on what developed out of that, and then potentially further discussion about where do we go next in terms of committees, commissions, what have you. And I'm presuming also there may be some very specific action items that come out in terms of we should go with this, we should go study this technology, we should go do whatever. Is that a general sense? Am I summarizing that correctly?
Yes.
Okay.
You get a small yes from me.
You get a small yes from you. Okay. I guess that's sort of, what's the opposite of a heck yes? It's just like, yeah, sort of okay. All right.
A lukewarm yes.
All right. Greg, do I need to do anything else at this point? That's it? Okay. Thank you, everybody. That was good. Thank you, Ken. Appreciate the input and the involvement, and I hope you will continue to do that. Council communications and announcements. First item 10A is reflections and agenda setting. I don't actually have personally any reflections for tonight's meeting, but if anybody else would like to share some or make some agenda setting suggestions, now's the time. Ron.
I have a report, so I'll wait.
Oh, okay.
And I assume this is an okay time to do it. Just was interested in the comments made by Mr. Osteler about 77 Walnut. I'd love to just get some feedback from staff at some point. It doesn't need to be at a meeting, but just some feedback about the gates and sort of the situation there, and just be able to provide some feedback back to that community, that homeowners association.
Without trying to limit what or direct or modify what you're saying, in the past, the council has on occasion directed staff to contact the individual and discuss the matter with them. And I mean, if you'd also like a report to council or a memo written to us, we can ask staff to do that too.
I'd be fine if staff would just reach out to him and have a discussion and understand the issue a little more.
Is that reasonable?
Yeah, we're absolutely able to do that. In fact, we're already in discussions with the homeowners association. What they're talking about was a condition of approval that the council put on the project to have a access point there for the public. So it would in the future require council action and to be agendized by the council if
we were to modify it.
If there's an interest in modifying that.
Okay. Any other reflections, agenda settings, or reports on? We'll also blend that into reports on subcommittees, boards, commissions, and committees. Sure, go ahead.
So a couple of things I wanted to report out on. A few weeks ago, I attended the League of California Cities training for new council members, and it was very helpful. They also talked a little bit about the expected legislation from a state perspective with Governor Newsom coming in, and one of the big areas that he's looking at is housing. So in addition to him asking for budget funds to address a number of issues around affordable housing, the discussion around Scott Wiener's proposal, SB 50, was a hot topic there. And just to kind of inform council and the community that proposal is that within a half a mile of any major public transportation hub, and the state would supersede a local ordinance, and properties could go up as high as 4 or 5 stories. And that would impact San Carlos from the point of Cedar to Industrial approximately, and from Hull to Olive. So given the fact that I know a lot of the community is concerned about the character of San Carlos and maintaining that, and we're also having an affordable housing issue, I just wanted to make folks aware of that, because I think it's something that we may need to weigh in on at some of these upcoming legislative areas. And then on a separate note, as I served as an alternate on the January 24th meeting of SBWMA, or also known as the Garbage Board. And one of the topics that came up was the idea of battery disposal. So lithium-ion batteries are becoming quite prolific and being included in all sorts of electronic devices, and they're also getting disposed of many times in the recycling bin, which can pose a fire hazard, as well as injure workers. And I understand it was a source of fire at the facility a couple of years back. So this orange bag is something that all of us received last year. There was about 2, I think we got 2 of them. The participation has been very good with this. The idea is that you put your batteries in the bag and you put it on top of the black bin. And they are getting a lot of participation in it, with so much so that they're going to continue the program. But because of the proliferation of lithium-ion batteries, the number of batteries that are going into the recycling bin is doubling. So just wanted to create a kind of a public service announcement about that. And, yes, we have a question from Ron.
Yeah, Laura, how do we get those? Because I don't remember.
Yes.
Yeah, do we just call Recology and they'll deliver them?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
That was...
I'll call Gino.
Yeah, so our Public Works Department has a supply available, so you can reach out to the city, as well as you can visit rethinkwaste.org /batteries and order them from Rethink Waste.
Ron, I use a lot of batteries, and I took yours. So, no, in all seriousness, I'm really glad you mentioned that. Just for the public's benefit too, I believe it's still the case that, which is what I often do, you can actually, if you're willing to, you can drive over to the recycling area and drop off the batteries. They have a or at least they did have a battery drop-off area. I admit the orange bag is a lot more convenient. So. Ron, I know you said you had some comments that you wanted to make.
Yeah, I just had a couple of things to report out on. I attended my first 2 board meetings for the Samtrans board and the Caltrain board, and thank you, Mark, for voting for me on that. Just one thing on Samtrans, they are starting a micro-transit pilot project. I think they're going to start it up in Pacifica. They're actually coming into the 21st century. They're using a phone app, and you can order a bus to pick you up. Right now, you have to do it the day before, but I'm hoping that they will do it in real time. But these are sort of mini buses, hold about 20, 30 people.
Wow.
But I was encouraged that it's a new concept that they're working, that's been tried in other cities, and they're going to run it for about a year. And then the second thing was, we also voted on last week to implement another pilot project, and this is probably a little bit longer, and it's going to be discounting fares for lower income riders. So they're trying, Caltrain caters to people who make over $100,000 a year. Samtrans is used by people who make less than 50, so there's really a gap in there. So what they're trying to do is be more inclusive, bring more people in, and they have a process to encourage people with lower incomes who can qualify. They will get, I think, 20% or more discount on Caltrain fares.
Thank you. Other comments? I had a couple of items to share. I got the opportunity to do a presentation to the Carlmont Key Club, which is basically the youth aspect of Kiwanis, the other day, and it was a lot of fun. The topic was one of my favorite ones, you can imagine after you hear it. It's, so what does the mayor actually do? And I basically told them very little, which is why I try to not be referred to as the mayor. No, but it was a good discussion, and young people asked a bunch of really probing questions, which I guess I shouldn't have been surprised, but it was really useful. I also wanted to mention to my colleagues that, as is often the case, I recently got a request from, I believe it's the Meals on Wheels program. Meals on Wheels delivers meals to seniors in town. And they like to do a thing where the mayor goes around with them one day during the cycle to hand out stuff. And I actually, I said to them I'd be happy to do that. But I also encouraged the group to reach out to all of you, because once again, what I was trying to explain to them is that really, if I think people would enjoy just seeing a council member, it doesn't have to be the chair or the mayor. So unless you have a problem with that, as I get these kind of requests, I'm going to sort of try and encourage all those groups to do that. I think the more that we all get out into the community, and it's not that we don't do that already, but the more we all get out there, I think it's better for both the community and for the entire council. Lastly, I had the discussion, Ron, that it's an idea prompted by your report from the board that you're on with that shuttle. I think we all got an email about, it was in response to an article about the San Carlos shuttle, the train station, and how it's not doing well financially. So, Jeff, when is the next time that program is going to come back for review by the council?
I'll have to check with staff and get back to you on that.
Okay. I just, if there's interest, I wouldn't mind having some kind of discussion of that sooner rather than later, because it's just, if there's something we can do to try and make it more successful, I would love to do that, just as a general principle. Is there anybody else who's interested in seeing that topic come forward?
I'm interested. I also wanted to add that I'm on the commute.org. I'm the representative, and I have my first lunch and learn this Thursday, which is also open to staff. I sent it on to Jeff if anybody wants to come from San Carlos.
Good. Okay. Well,
so I will report back on that too.
Thank you. Then we'll put that in the agenda.
We'll do that, yeah. And I know we actually have something in process already on that, so I just don't know where it's at.
Good. All right. So we'll move to staff comments on city administrative business. Jeff and Greg.
I just thought I'd take this opportunity to provide a brief comment on the allegation at your last meeting made by members of the public that the prior council, quote, may not have fully complied with open meeting laws. That was the sentence in the letter. I took a look at the code section that was cited there, and my opinion is that it's not applicable to the situation that the council faced back in October. The subcommittee that made its report was not the type of subcommittee that was contemplated by the statute, because it never held any public meetings. It was basically two council members who are allowed under the Brown Act to discuss one item and interact with staff and then come up with recommendations. So the Brown Act provision that was cited to is inapplicable to that type of a situation. And you know, the fact was that there was plenty of public input and opportunity to talk about the item, and including discussion about the most appropriate FAR. At I think I counted there were 9 meetings of the Planning Commission and committees that looked at the issue of house size, and before the council introduced the ordinance on October 22nd. So that's just a brief report. I'd be glad to kind of issue something in more detail, but I think it was important and appropriate for me to comment on it, since it was made at a public meeting at public comment.
Thank you, Greg. No, I appreciate you doing that. And I presume if any member of the public has questions about that, they're welcome to contact you, right?
If they would like to contact me, I will talk with them about it.
I would like to make a comment. I realize there's only one member of the public in here, but there are people that watch at home, and I would like to say that People need to understand that there's a city attorney at every meeting we have. And if we wander into any area that is a violation of the Brown Act, we are warned immediately. When we have a retreat or a strategic planning session, our city attorney is with us, and he has never failed to notify us if we are getting close to Brown Act violations. So I know that this particular charge comes up from time to time, but people need to understand that, this is something that we are schooled in when we first join the council, and we are reminded of constantly. So I want people to understand that we are keenly aware of the Brown Act always, and we make every effort to follow it.
And you know what? Thank you. I agree with what you said. In the interest of not about this particular issue or any issue in general, I think we also need to recognize that there certainly are examples of where public organizations have, in fact, deliberately or inadvertently violated the Brown Act and the open meeting laws. So there's not, personally, I don't have a problem with people making the complaint and saying, gee, I think there's a problem. And I'm not saying you do either, Ron. That's part of the reason why I'm actually glad that Greg took the time to kind of provide the perspective that he did and to do the research and look into it, because it's a pretty serious allegation, and it's certainly one that none of us want to do. And I just appreciate Greg taking the time to explain it. So with that, Jeff, did you have any other comments? Then I will adjourn the meeting.